You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway. Only on Sputnik Radio.
Democratic Party royalty, Andrew Cuomo crashes and burns. The latest to be cut down by the increased sensibility across the world to sexual predation. And the danger of war in the Gulf is back with us again. Israel announces that it is ready for war with Iran. Problem for Israel is it won't just be war with Iran. As events in the Lebanon showed this very week, there are more fronts than one in any Israel-Iranian confrontation. And we'll be looking at British politics, where Boris Johnson threatened to sack his successor, Rishi Sunak, the erstwhile Chancellor of the Exchequer. Looking across the world at all the big issues that have been dominating the news agenda over the last 7 days. It's the Open University of the Airwaves. It's free to air, and you are encouraged to speak back to the teacher. So fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy ride. It always is. Episode 112 of the mother of all talk shows, coming up now.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language.
The mother of all talk shows. The only education you can get for free. George Galloway.
This is Radio Sputnik.
Almost 20 years ago, I told the Labour government of Tony Blair and Jack Straw that their foolhardiness in invading and occupying Afghanistan would come to naught, but not before an ocean of blood and a mountain of treasure was expended and wasted. As we watch the United States and Britain steal out of Afghanistan like thieves in the night, redolent of the scramble out of Saigon as the People's Forces closed in on the American embassy. We are retreating under fire, scuttling under fire out of Afghanistan. And what was it all about? We are about to see the very same people back in power that we drove out 20 years ago. Just get your head around a 20-year war, one that cost over $1 trillion, one that cost the life's blood of hundreds of thousands of people, the sanity of thousands more, the limbs of thousands more. It has been an unmitigated disaster, and I never took less pleasure than I do in saying, I told you so. This was madness from the beginning. Nobody has successfully invaded, occupied Afghanistan, not even Alexander the Great. And Joe Biden sure ain't Alexander the Great. I'll be talking throughout the show about Tony Blair because he's just announced that his comeback plans have been put to one side. Well, the first thing I have to say is you can't believe a word that Tony Blair says. You can only tell he's lying because his lips are moving. So don't take that as the final word, but it's welcome insofar as it goes. The return of the sepulchral, satanic majesty of Tony Blair to frontline British politics would have been a nightmare on Elm Street. That is for sure. It's not at all clear how he would have got back into the House of Commons. given that there are no safe Labour seats. Certainly not for Tony Blair to be found anywhere. I myself would have stood against him in any constituency in the country to give proper Labour people the opportunity to vote for proper Labour, rather than the antithesis of Labour represented by Tony Blair. But I was doubtful that he was going to make a comeback for a couple of reasons, which are in addition to the difficulty of getting back into the House of Commons. First of all, you've got to register all of your income in the House of Commons. And that would have been embarrassing, to say the least, for Tony Blair, a man paid by the head-chopping, bone-sawing, Al-Qaeda and ISIS funding Saudi Arabia. That would have been difficult for a Labour leader to square. £100 million he's taken from the murkiest sources of finance on the planet, and it would all have been there in black and white. Of course, clever accountants would have done their best to wash the money. But the third reason for not coming back into frontline politics is, why bother? Tony Blair is back in charge. He is running the show. Peter Mandelson and Tony Blair are back running the Labour Party. Just think about that. Now, once upon a time, Andrew Cuomo was the great white hope of the Democratic Party. Like his father, something of an orator, but also something of the night about him. What we did not know then, but know now, is that as a sexual predator of a particularly pernicious kind, he had few rivals in American politics. Perhaps only Donald Trump was as base a predator as Andrew Cuomo has turned out to be. The investigation by the Attorney General of the state of New York makes dismal, grisly, but devastating reading. There's no way back from that. There's no way to run again as governor of New York from that. There's no way to even dream of being a Democratic presidential candidate after all that. We'll be talking in a few minutes to a woman who knows all about it. It was also the week in which the new Israeli premier, and if you needed any evidence that the new Israeli premier is no different to the last Israeli premier, announced that Israel was ready for war with Iran. Iran, of course, is ready for war with Israel, so it wouldn't be a one-sided war. And although Israel has hundreds of nuclear weapons, they would not be able to use them, not least because they'd be nuking the entire region in which they live and in which live their new best friends in Saudi Arabia, in the United Arab Emirates, and elsewhere in the Persian Gulf. I say coyly elsewhere because, well, I'm waiting for the official announcement before I give you the official denouncement of those particular regimes. But if it's a conventional war that Israel launches against Iran, it's going to find itself in a very difficult place very quickly. For a start, Iran has more than sufficient range and quality of missiles to land them in profusion on the territory of Israel, and even more so on the territory of Israel's new best friends all around them. Anybody that allowed their airspace to be used, their sea lanes to be used for an Israeli attack on Iran would immediately become combatant in the conflict that would ensue. And that's where I have to give my now annual advice to people, and I know a lot of you like to do it. Dubai would not be a safe place to be on holiday or to buy property in the event of an Israel-Iran war, because Dubai is very close by to Iran and would be incinerated in moments, within moments of any Israeli attack on Iran. The Straits of Hormuz would be immediately blocked. 25% of the world's oil would thus become inoperable. Economic crisis would spread quickly throughout the world. The price of oil would multiply by several times. Saudi Arabia and its oil wells would also be easily within range of devastating Iranian counter-fire, not just from Iran. You see, Iran has friends, and they have rockets. The resistance fighters in Yemen have already landed rockets on Saudi Arabia and would be sure to do so again. The resistance movements in Iraq have the weapons capability of landing missiles on Israel. But perhaps Israel's biggest problem would be the immediate creation of a new war front in Lebanon, where the resistance defeated the Israeli invaders and would-be occupiers just in 2006, and the anniversary of that has just passed. So if Israel is ready for war with Iran, as its Prime Minister says it is, it better be ready for a war with several other people too. And that's the problem, you see. Because if it was just a fight in a far-off place of which most people know little, that would be of only marginal moment. But the danger of everyone else being dragged into such a conflagration is great, not least because in their wisdom, or lack of it, Britain and the United States have heavily interposed their naval assets into the Persian Gulf. They would be targets, and they would presumably fire back, and then we're into a multinational war in the Gulf. What could possibly go wrong? Just as we're ending the conflict in Afghanistan, we might be about to enter another one. Not that we've ever really gone away. I did a program yesterday for television about the secret fact that at least 50 British Special Forces soldiers are actually inside Yemen, helping Saudi Arabia's doomed war effort against its poor neighbor Yemen, where millions of children live on the brink of famine, prey to periodic waves of disease of almost primeval kind. How, having denied to the British Parliament that British forces were involved in this war, having denied to the British public and presumably the British sovereign whose armed forces they are, this can possibly be true, I'll leave you to work out. Not that anyone in Parliament is pressing them on it, but I have learned, and it's now widely known, that our forces are in the Al-Qaeda air base in the eastern province of Yemen, which Human Rights Watch has denounced as a torture chamber. When I put it to a retired British military officer yesterday, how can our soldiers be in an air base that Human Rights Watch have said is a place where widespread torture is being practiced? He answered, as I'm sure he'll come to regret, the British will be in a soundproofed hangar and therefore will hear no screams. That's the reality, grubby, bloody, dirty reality of Britain and the United States and its role across the world in the 21st century. I'm not even going to visit the crimes of the 20th or even of the 19th. In the 21st century, it's been one long bloody war, each one more disastrous than the next one. And the next one might be the most disastrous of all. We'll be talking about Donald Trump, about Joe Biden, about Boris Johnson, about Rishi Sunak. And I'm dedicating this show to my one-year-old daughter, Oban Amaria, who celebrated her first birthday in Scotland today. I couldn't be with her, but she's watching this on the screen now. I had to be in London presenting this show. But for your last child to celebrate her first birthday is a joy, I can assure you. So happy birthday, lovely Oban. Fasten your seatbelts, why don't you? Because this is the mother of all talk shows. You can watch us as well as listen on FM in the United States, in Washington, D.C., 105.5. You can listen on AM right across the United States from Burning City to Burning City. You can listen all over the world on SputnikNews.com. And you can watch, as 500,000 of you every week now are doing, on all platforms, on Facebook, on YouTube, on Twitter, on Telegram, on Twitch. I understand there are 16 platforms now on which you can watch the mother of all talk shows. But you can also download the podcast every single week, which is doubling every single week. I'm not joking. It can't go on doubling, but it has doubled every single week since we began it and is now one of the most watched political podcasts anywhere in the world. Now we've got a poll running. Were the US and the UK right to pull out of Afghanistan? A, yes. B, no. C, should never have gone in. Now, here's my bonus question. On this day in 1974, my goodness, was it that long ago? It was almost my 20th birthday. On this day, on 1974, US President Richard M. Nixon announced he would resign the next day. Who succeeded him? A, Gerald Ford. B, Ronald Reagan. C, George Bush Sr. Answer after the break.
Radio Sputnik.
Gosh darn, how do you get this thing to work? Is it that one? Is it this one here? Gosh, was this thing built in America? Jeez. Kamala, would you get in here? I can't get the, gosh darn wireless to work.
You know I can't answer questions, Joe, when I'm laughing.
I'm trying to, listen to that Scottish guy on the wireless, the Galloway fella.
Oh, Joe, you're so funny.
I've been pressing this red button on and off and on and off. Heck, I can't get it to work. Hello, Biden residence.
Mr. President, be advised, we have executed the airstrike on Syria. Confirmed.
That's just great. How long until it gets delivered? I'm starving.
Sputnik has been launched to give you a closer look at everything happening in the world. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
the mother of all talk shows. Join our faculty of legends, contributors, and callers. Everyone is welcome.
And the answer was, of course, Gerald Ford, possibly the stupidest president that the United States ever had, a man of whom it was said he could not chew gum and walk in a straight line at the same time. We've got lots of stupid leaders around the world, of course, and also stupid would-be leaders, one of whom would appear to have been the governor of the state of New York, Andrew Cuomo. I talked earlier about the scandal in which he is now enveloped, but let's hear from an expert. Alexandra Brodsky is a civil rights attorney and the author of Sexual Justice. Alexandra, many thanks for coming on the mother of all talk shows. Perhaps you would sketch first exactly what the report into Andrew Cuomo's horrific sexual predatory activities actually concluded.
Sure. So Cuomo had faced a whole range of different allegations of verbal and physical sexual harassment. And the Attorney General's office in New York deputized some independent attorneys to interview a huge number of witnesses, review, voluminous documents, and concluded that Cuomo had engaged in a sustained pattern of groping and sexual comments and sexual harassment really of every kind of women on his staff and within New York government more broadly, pulling in women to work on his detail who technically didn't fit the qualifications, but he had seen the day before, touching them in all sorts of ways. And the report concluded that these allegations were true, and that many of them likely violated both state and federal law. So Cuomo is now facing probes from district attorneys who appear to be considering criminal charges.
Now, we'll come to the criminal charges in a minute, but the political impact is surely fatal, isn't it?
I would like to think so. We see, it appears, legislators really getting in line, ready to move forward with impeachment. But Cuomo has really 9 lives, it seemed like. I was shocked that he survived the initial wave of allegations, where I think that many other politicians would have stepped down if they faced, a quarter of the allegations he had faced back, earlier this year. And his defenses at this point seem really thin. He's talking vaguely about political conspiracies to take him down, when it looks like the investigation here was done, really, all above board, impeccable attention to detail. But, again, we'll see. There seemed to be no, bottom to how dirty New York politics can get, and he certainly still does have allies in power.
It wasn't a death sentence then when President Biden said that he should resign, partly because of President Biden's own rather murky past in these things.
Yeah, whenever Biden is called to comment on these kinds of allegations, it's always a little bit complicated. What I think is, I guess, different and I hope fatal for Cuomo's political career is that lawyers have found their receipts. They've corroborated these evidence. What I have found in, my work as an attorney and in my research, and which I discuss in my new book, is that often when, powerful men are accused of these kinds of offenses, they, call out for due process, which is, really important. When people face accusations of any kind, they deserve to have their chance to be heard, to see the evidence, all of that. But they use due process, this, legal term, to really mean I shouldn't get in trouble. And they keep moving the goalpost. They keep saying that it needs to be proven up again, that there needs to be another investigation, that there needs to be, a whole other trial. And, I think what we're going to have to see here is whether New York voters and legislatures recognize that Cuomo has gotten a fair process, and that he just doesn't like the result. He doesn't like the verdict. or if they're going to allow him and, the powerful group of attorneys that he has brought together to defend him, to make him seem like a victim of, a political conspiracy, a victim of, a failure of due process, who needs another series of months, another year of investigation before we can, quote unquote, know the truth. And, if the more time that Cuomo is able to buy, the longer, the bigger risk there is that political will dies out, and bigger risk that he's just able to sort of, end up, finish his term and never actually have to step down.
His default position in the past has been to say everyone's out to get him because he's an Italian. Has that defense been out yet?
I haven't. I know that he does like to pull on that. I haven't seen him use that line here. He has this whole, theory that's honestly kind of embarrassing about how, people who have investigated him for ethics violations in the past are now trying to trump up these charges against him to take him down again. I don't think that having, I don't find that argument particularly compelling, because it all depends on him, us looking to his long history of unethical behavior that required law enforcement investigation. I think a lot of his defense at this point also boils down to, everyone's so sensitive these days. I'm friendly to everyone. He had this ridiculous slideshow of him kissing all kinds of different politicians on the cheek, as though that was proof that what these women were complaining of is just how he interacts with everyone. The New York City Mayor, Bill de Blasio, I think put it well when he said there's no generational divide about whether you can put your hand up someone's shirt and grope them. That's just not the kind of allegations that we're dealing with here.
He also told the state trooper on his detail that when he was looking for women, they had to be women that liked pain. That was a particularly disturbing aspect. Can you enlighten us on that?
Yeah, I'm just totally gross. And I think, really shows how silly it is for him to pretend that he's just, a casual guy who's just having, jokey conversations in the workplace with his colleagues. That's not the kind of comment that you were ever allowed to make in the workplace. And if you were, that was a problem. That was part of the problem that, Me Too and movements against sexual harassment have been trying to fix. I think it speaks to not just a lack of boundaries or a lack of judgment, but really a desire to make people uncomfortable, to push them, to deny their humanity and their right to participate in the workplace safely without that kind of sexualization. I think that anyone who reads this report really just has to conclude that this man can't be trusted to govern New York. And, maybe it's a shame that they feel like their political futures were tied to him, as I imagine is the case with many of his defenders. But we've got the facts, and now we need the legislature to just, move forward and pull the trigger.
All he needs
is a metaphor, because he'll just go on with his life being fine and, being perfectly famous and wealthy and in privacy.
All he needs now is Bill Clinton to come out and defend him. Have the Clintons any particular relationship to Cuomo?
I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's actually comparing how Democrats have responded to Cuomo versus how they responded to the allegations against Bill Clinton that have continued over the years. I think actually points to progress that this isn't true of the Republicans, but at least the Democrats aren't willing to protect their own when the facts come in and it's clear that someone's really crossed a line. And I don't think that was true even a couple of years ago, and I certainly don't think that was true in the 90s when Clinton was president.
So what happens next? What federal charges might be brought? What state charges might be brought?
So, I think that is up to a lot of different district attorneys in a lot of different parts of the state, because, the report suggests that Cuomo committed some potential criminal offenses in different jurisdictions, but it seems like he might have violated some federal sexual harassment laws and also just local sexual assault laws. And, I've read that some district attorneys are investigating and deciding whether to bring forward charges. I wouldn't be shocked if one of the reasons that Cuomo is holding on right now and refusing to step down is that he's hoping that he can negotiate some kind of deal where he'll agree to resign in exchange for some kind of immunity from further charges. And there are so many different legal players here, so many different legal, state and local offices that seems complicated, but I do wonder if that's part of why he's not just going quietly now.
Now, you mentioned Bill de Blasio, the mayor of New York City. He has his eye on the governorship. Were Cuomo to fall, might he be his successor, and how squeaky clean is he?
I've never heard anything about de Blasio in terms of sexual harassment. He's had some corruption investigations of his office. It's funny, if you'd asked me this a year ago, I would have said there is no way in hell. New Yorkers were really mad that de Blasio, rather than focusing on the task in front of him as mayor, was distracted by political ambitions. But we've just gone through this really messy mayoral race where suddenly I think Bill de Blasio is looking pretty good comparatively. But I think someone who's definitely come out of this, this whole investigation looking like a very serious contender is Tish James, who's the attorney general, who likely has gubernatorial ambitions of her own.
And tell us about your book, finally. Sexual Justice. Seems like a good time to be bringing out that book, I must say. It's funny. So the book is about sexual harassment and due process. And it seems like there's just, for worse, there's just sort of always new material. But, what I talk about in the book is how it really is very important that when allegations of sexual harassment are levied, whether against, famous men or just ordinary people, that the accused get the chance to be heard and tell their side of the story. But it's also true that bad actors, particularly but not exclusively on the right, will co-opt this rhetoric of due process in order to further their true goal, which is just, impunity, which is tolerance for sexual harm. And that we have to be able to hold both of those ideas in our head at the same time. So the book comes out later this month. And I'm glad to be part of this conversation. Alexandra, thanks for joining us on the mother of all talk shows, and good luck with the book. As you say, no shortage of new material. Thank you.
Amen. Thanks for having me.
For joining us. Now, some social media. Kingsley says, thank God it's Friday. Thank George it's Sunday. Informed is knowledge is food. Thank you very much. And Marek says, the Taliban were just waiting for them to leave so they could impose Islamist rule again. And the US and UK knew it. So what did they achieve in all those years? Precisely nothing. Precisely right. And Ron says, I really have no idea, George. It is all very complex. How do you withdraw without handing the country to the Taliban? I leave you to work this sort of thing out. Westminster and Washington can't. Well, as the Irishman probably apocryphally said when asked the direction to Dublin, I wouldn't have started from here. And John Miles says, we can't undo the mistakes of the past, but we should have learned from the USSR's futile experience in Afghanistan during the 1980s. And Stryker says, they were wrong to leave since they left the job unfinished, should have completely annihilated the Taliban and pressurized Pakistan to stop funding, training, and supporting them. Stryker, you can pick up your tin hat and your body armor at the door. Soraya says, frankly, the world is complicit in giving them a carte blanche to kill and ravage. UN Security Council adopted Resolution 1373, and all who voted in favor are guilty. And Baggy says, yes, enough dead Westerners. Leave them to it. If they want to stone women to death in sports stadiums, it just goes to prove that religion, especially Islam, is backwards. Who needs to stone women in stadiums? Blow their heads off with drones and B-52s instead. And Imma says Afghan heroin prices are already going up in the USA. And Brian Holden says America has leapt from barbarism to decadence without touching civilization. Great Oscar Wilde quote, Brian. And Enrique says they have tried to provoke Iran in all ways possible to retaliate. So to use that as a precursor to start a war. If I was Iran, I would say, don't fall for the trap. Now, here's the phone numbers. If you're in the United Kingdom, the phone lines are open. It's completely free to call. And the number is 08081 965522. That's 08081 965522. If you're in the United States, it's also completely free to call the show. And it's +1 844 944 3344. That's +1 844 944 3344. You can email the show at any time on air at moats.tv. And you can, of course, tweet us at George Galloway at RTUK. Now, let's take a call. Have we got one? Michael is in Sydney, where it's early in the morning. Michael, very, very good of you to call.
I stayed up, especially George. I've missed the last few shows, but I was up late last night, so I just stayed awake and slept today.
Thank you very much for that, Michael. Go ahead.
That's all right. George. I'm just ringing about, obviously, the last guest. I mean, I fully support, obviously, the cause for women's justice and everything. But it's quite convenient. I did a bit of a cursory research on the guest, and she's written for the New York Times and the Washington Post, and she obviously seems to be quite entrenched within the Democratic Party. There seems to be a bit of civil war going on there in New York, which seems to what this is all about. And the same group of women who are coming out and blasting de Blasio are silent on Tara Reid and Joe Biden and his alleged affair and his alleged his hair sniffing and all that type of weird stuff that he does. He
was doing it again this week. Biden was doing it again this week. Who gives their small child to Joe Biden to sit next to? To sniff their hair and nuzzle their neck. This is the president of the United States of America with a kid.
Yeah, and she probably belongs to the same faction as Hillary Clinton, who defended George through all his who defended Bill through all his sexual jaunts and through the White House, and you got Donald Trump. I mean, really the only president really in my lifetime that I do remember Reagan and the first Bush, and it's really the second Bush. I mean, other than being a war criminal and an outright filthy human being, I mean, at least he wasn't accused of anything sexual that I know of.
No, he just killed and tortured a lot of folks.
Yeah, exactly, yeah, and blew up a lot of women, but that's all right. We can blow up brown women and children, but yeah. But also, just on you talked about Iran. I was going to say, as America's actually conveniently put all their bases within missile range of Iran, and there's been reports coming out. It's been publicised on RT and other news channels that America's actually withdrawn all its fleet, all its naval fleet out of the Persian Gulf and moved it to the Red Sea and to the Mediterranean because they're within striking distance of the Iranian standoff weapons. As well, what people don't really understand about the change in military balance is you don't have to be 500 kilometres away anymore to strike. You can strike 1,000 kilometres away. And you're talking about Hezbollah, you're talking about Syria, you're talking about the PMU, you're talking about Yemen. They're all within striking range of these American vessels sitting in the Red Sea and in the Mediterranean. And the PMU has weapons, the Popular Mobilization Units in Iraq. Syria has weapons. Hezbollah has weapons. And the old arc of instability, they've destabilised it, but they've actually united it in destabilising it. So they've achieved the very thing they set out not to achieve.
Well, missile technology is a great leveller, and you can claim you've got an Iron Dome. It's doubtful whether the Iron Dome stops a decent percentage, never mind all, of the ordnance coming in. But
America has actually approved.
Yeah.
America has approved a resupply, an emergency resupply of the Israeli Iron Dome system. Just recently, $700 million worth of weapons back after the war with after the brief war with Hezbollah. In Gaza. In Gaza. So what are they going to do when they've got Hezbollah, they've got Syria, they've got Yemen, they've got Iraq, they've got Iran, and they've got possibly even Yemen launching weapons against them? I mean, coming from all directions, from everywhere, and they got 5 or 6 countries doing it, as opposed to one little Gaza Strip doing it.
Absolutely, very, very well put. The days of Israeli military hegemony in the region are gone, and it shows again the law of unintended consequence in destroying the Arab power in Iraq. The United States and the United Kingdom brought forth a Persian power in the Gulf, one which has a very long and wide reach.
And in case anyone hasn't noticed, Turkey's sharpening its sword too.
Yes.
It's not exactly on friendly terms with Israel at the moment as well.
Yes, and Israel
and actually,
has
Iran
now
and Turkey
described...
Iran and Turkey are quite close at the moment.
Yeah, and the Israelis have said that Turkey has moved from being a friendly country to a cause for concern. Very well summed up, Michael.
Egypt's doing push-ups to the towel.
All the best to you. Thanks very much indeed for that call. Now, in 1963, the Glasgow to Euston mail train was ambushed and more than £2 million stolen, which in 1963 was a very lot of money. Which, by the way, does that mean they were Scottish banknotes if it was the mail train from Glasgow? There's a question. Never mind reading out questions. Let me ask the editor the answer to that one. Was it Scottish banknotes? In which case, how did they manage to pass them in newsagents in East London? In 1963, the Glasgow to Euston mail train was ambushed and more than £2 million stolen. Which of the great train robbers fled to Brazil? Was it A, Charlie Wilson, B, Jeff Nugent, or C, Ronald Biggs? Answer after the break.
Radio Sputnik.
Peter says the Afghan people have lost, George. I thought you were better than this, to be honest. Give me a call, Peter. Tell me what you mean. And Oliver says, for some reason, George was on the jihadist side when it came to Yugoslavia. And that's the reason I will never trust him. I fought against the war on Yugoslavia with all my breath and all my heart. Me and Tony Benn and Jeremy Corbyn and others were practically the only people in this country opposing the war on Yugoslavia, the destruction of Yugoslavia. How dare you, you imbecile? If you have any guts, you'll pick up the phone right now and call this show and justify that utter slander. Really. And Yoda says, love the show. Best entertainment and education on the airwaves.
Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Well, the answer, of course, was Ronald Biggs, who was famously brought back to Britain after decades there by Inspector Jack Slipper of the Yard. I've never forgotten that fact. Now, let's hear from Professor Mohammed Marandi, who is the chair of American Studies at the University of Tehran. Professor Marandi, thank you for joining us. I'm intrigued by your job. Many people would be surprised that there's a Department of American Studies in the University of Tehran. Tell us first, are there a lot of students queuing up to learn American studies?
Well, our program is a graduate studies program. We have both an MA as well as a PhD program. The MA program has been going on for roughly 16 years now. And I think the PhD program, 12, 13 years. So we've had lots of students and lots of graduates, and some of them are now professors, others are abroad, most are in Iran, doing work in different places at research institutes, media, and other places as well.
And are you any closer to understanding the United States of America and why it seems to be bent on war around the world?
Well, the United States is a very, very complicated country, and that's one reason, or the main reason, why we have an American Studies program. It is obviously of great concern for Iranians how the United States behaves and why it behaves in such a manner. So we at the University of Tehran set up this program so that people in Iran could have a better understanding. Of course, there are many programs in Iran that are linked to American studies. Almost all universities, I think, in Iran have English departments. Most important universities, if not all of them, have international relations, politics. So the United States is studied in one form or another in Iran, whether it's in the social sciences, fine arts, cinema, or the American Studies program, as I'm involved with.
Very interesting. Now, we'll come back to America, indubitably, but this week, the new Prime Minister of Israel said he was ready for war with your country. I happen to know that your country is ready for war with him if he starts one. So how serious is this?
As we speak, I have not heard anyone take him seriously in Iran. Israel is a very small country. Half the population is Palestinian and they're subjugated. So the Israeli regime has to spend a lot of energy keeping these people down. The Israelis have not done well in their war with Gaza, a small, landlocked, surrounded population, which is starving of medicine and electricity and clean water. Yet they held their own. The Israelis did not dare to enter Gaza despite killing large numbers of innocent civilians. And the Gazans, despite the fact that their missile technology, which is new to them, is still not highly developed, many of their missiles did get through the so-called Iron Dome. So when the Israeli regime fails against the subjugated people of Gaza, who are living in as we all have heard many times, the largest concentration camp on this planet, they're not really in a position to talk much about a war against Iran. If the Israelis strike Iran, Israel is a small country. Iran would counterstrike with probably hundreds, if not thousands, of missiles. And I don't really think the Israelis want that.
Why say it then? I mean, there's a limit to how much the school bully can continue to cow people merely by issuing threats. Now and again, he's got to live up to the threats.
I think there are probably two things that come to mind and seem to make a lot of sense right now. One is internal politics. Israel is a right-wing. The country has turned to the right. It's very right-wing. And the country is also deeply divided. The Netanyahu supporters would want to bring down this government as soon as possible. Both compete to look tough in the eyes of, as I said, a very right-wing Israeli society. The second, I think, is the legacy of arrogance. They've been the bully on the block, as you've pointed out, for a very long period of time, but the world has changed. Lebanon has changed. Hezbollah is a very powerful force. As soon as the Israelis began firing shells into Lebanon and bombing the country, that Hezbollah retaliated and the Israelis stopped. And the same is true in Gaza. And of course, we see Yemen on the rise. We see Syria surviving this onslaught of extremists, tens of thousands of foreign fighters brought into the country by its antagonists, and the Israelis were a part of that. So we sort of see the tide turning against the Israeli regime, but this legacy of arrogance, I think, is still very much a part of the culture of this apartheid state.
Aren't they implicitly, though, threatening you and indeed others with America's army? They're hoping they can draw the United States into a conflict.
Yes, everyone in this region allied to the United States wants to use the Americans as their armed forces, whether it's the Israelis or the Saudis or the Emiratis. But I think here, too, the world has changed dramatically. The United States in 2001 was the superpower, and we all recall how easily they went into Afghanistan and how easily they went into Iraq, despite all the anti-war protests, such as the one in London, which I participated in, by the way. But the United States back then was the sole superpower. It had a lot of support, unfortunately, and a lot of material capability and economic resources to use in these wars. But the United States is, after spending almost, I don't know, maybe $9-10 trillion now, they're withdrawing from Afghanistan, they're cutting costs in Iraq. This is a very different United States. And on the other hand, in 2001, China was a very different country. Russia was a very different country. Russia had just begun to emerge from the ashes of the post-Soviet Union era, and China was just beginning to emerge. So now the United States has very powerful rivals. The United States is badly weakened because of its own foolishness in this region. And Iran, which was an isolated country surrounded to the west by Saddam Hussein and to the east by the Taliban, which the Americans actually helped bring to power, the Americans and the Saudis, which that's a story in itself. It's now the most influential country in West Asia. Iran has allies in Iraq and Syria and Lebanon, in Yemen, in Afghanistan, and Iran's antagonists, U.S. allies, are on the back foot. The Saudis are tired of war, the Israeli regime we've discussed. So the situation is very different from before.
Indeed so. And this is the law of unintended consequences again, isn't it?
That's exactly true.
They have pushed Russia and China very much close together economically, in terms of currency, and perhaps most importantly, militarily, the interoperability, joint war games, and fantastic development of weapon systems, particularly in Russia, anti-aircraft, and also now jet fighter technology, which is not just cutting edge, but out of sight of other countries. And they've made this bloc of China and Russia, and now they've made a bloc of China, Russia, and Iran. And Iran already has, as you said, all these allies right across that crescent, from Iran through Iraq, into Syria, into Lebanon. Is foreign policy run by idiots in the West?
Definitely. I can't see any other explanation. Iran has, for hundreds of years, been oriented towards the West because they've dominated this country. The second language here is English. At all universities, we study English as our second language. Most of our textbooks are translations from English textbooks. Many young people go to English-speaking countries to get their PhDs or to continue their studies. But when the United States constantly, and when its allies constantly antagonize Iran, then gradually you see Iran shift away from the United States and Europe. We see that now China is much more of an important trading partner for Iran than Western countries. So when Western countries sanction the country, they impose maximum pressure sanctions to make ordinary people suffer as much as possible. Not only does that create hatred and contempt among politicians and the population, but it also creates an incentive for Iran to move towards those countries that open their doors and carry out trade or behave in a friendly manner. And that, of course, includes countries like Russia and China. And the same is true for China and Russia. When the United States and the Europeans try to isolate China, then they have an incentive to move closer towards Iran and Iran's allies. And the same is true with Russia. So the fools in the White House, as well as the fools in Western capitals, just like the fools in Tel Aviv, I think they make many of their decisions based upon this tradition of arrogance, this feeling of being exceptional, but they don't have the power that they once have. They don't have the capabilities that they once have. And I think we're seeing sort of multiple Suez moments as we move along during the last few years. And I think in the months and years ahead, we'll be seeing more of that.
Now, you have a new president, described normally as hardline. You're in talks in Vienna. Process hasn't finished. Do you expect the United States to re-enter the nuclear deal?
The reason why they call the new president in Western countries a hardliner is because he's adamant that Iran's sovereignty must be preserved. No one believes that he's being hardline towards Argentina or Brazil or Bolivia or Venezuela or South Africa or Morocco or India or China. The issue is the United States. And the problem is that the United States is not willing to treat Iran as an equal country. It's not willing to treat the Iranian people with respect. And a good example of this was the nuclear deal that was signed in 2015. After the deal, under Obama, the United States failed to abide by its commitments, whereas Iran did. Under Trump, the United States tore the agreement. And under Biden, the United States is still pursuing Trump's policies. And then recently in Vienna, during the negotiations, the Americans and the Europeans, they demanded new concessions, and they also demanded that many of the sanctions that were imposed after the deal, that violate the deal in the spirit of the deal, that they remain in place, and that Iran adds conditions imposed upon Iran in order for the deal to be implemented. And that's not the JCPOA. So when the United States treats Iran as such, then I find it very difficult for us to move back to the JCPOA or the nuclear deal under these circumstances. If the Americans and the Europeans continue to expect that Iran give more than what was already agreed upon, which is appeasement, I don't think we're going to have a deal, because I don't see Iran appeasing the United States or the Europeans.
And if you don't have a deal, you'll continue to enrich uranium outside of the terms of the original deal, correct?
Absolutely. Iran has gone back to the NPT and the regulations within the IAEA. So Iran is allowed to do what it's doing today within the framework of international law, but not within the framework of the nuclear deal. But if the other side does not abide by the deal, then Iran is not going to abide by its commitment either. So Iran is going to develop its enrichment program, it's going to develop its nuclear program as far as possible within the framework of international law. And there's also another element to it. While Iranians are suffering, and there's no doubt that Iranians are suffering. The Americans and the Europeans are trying to make ordinary Iranians suffer as much as possible. This is a war against ordinary people, these sanctions. However, Obama himself, when he initiated these maximum pressure sanctions, it wasn't Trump who started this, it was Obama. And then there was a deal, and then we got to Trump. When Obama signed, after the United States signed the JCPOA along with Iran and other countries, because the United States accepted Iran's right to enrichment, then the Iranians agreed to talk, and then we had the deal. When he faced criticism for signing the deal, Obama himself said, these sanctions will not last forever. Gradually, the sanctions regime will fall apart. And I wanted to sign a deal before that process began. So this is something that Obama himself admitted. The Iranians are already passing through the worst of these sanctions, and it is gradually finding new partners, also enabling or finding the capability inside the country to overcome some of the problems that were created by the sanctions. It's still tough, but it's no longer as bad as it was 2-3 years ago. So as Russia and China and other countries rise, as Iran rises further, as the United States and its allies find it more difficult, the sanctions regime is going to erode even more swiftly. So time is not on the side of the Americans or the Europeans, but still it's that arrogance that prevents them from behaving sensibly, signing the deal, going back to 2015, and engaging with Iran as a normal country. It's not possible for them, it seems, at least at the moment.
Professor, it's been a pleasure talking with you. Thanks for joining us on the Mother of All Talk shows. I'm glad you were on our demonstration too. Now, I slightly exaggerated, sometimes I do. Downloads of the podcast last week were up 80%. I said they had doubled. 49 countries downloaded our podcast, from Greece to Gibraltar to Ghana to Gambia. In fact, this just in. How about this? Just treasure this. Tonight, we are the #1 political podcast in Egypt. Thank you for all the great reviews you've been leaving on Apple Podcasts, and including this one. In British politics, Mr. Galloway stands as the last bastion of sense. Like a fine wine, he gets better with age. I have been a fan of his since 2002. I would recommend anyone to listen to him. The best podcast around. That is from Sira Luop. Thank you very much indeed. That was touching testimony. Thank you so much. If you do listen, give a 5-star review. Why don't you? Let's take the news with Jamie Lowe.
The mother of all talk shows. The only education you can get for free.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Radio Sputnik News.
The COVID-delayed 2020 Olympics in Tokyo have closed, with athletes parading in the closing ceremony. At the end of the ceremony, the Olympic flag was handed over to Paris, where the Games are to be held in 2024, and the Olympic flames extinguished. Digital signs displayed arigato, which is thank you in Japanese. The United States came top of the medal table with 113 in total. China was the second most successful nation. Team GB was fourth with 65 medals, 22 gold, 21 silvers and 22 bronze. Fully vaccinated people can now visit France without quarantining on their return to Britain after travel rule changes came into force earlier today. France moved on to the amber list, which means children and fully vaccinated passengers do not have to quarantine on their return, although unvaccinated travellers still have to self-isolate at home for 10 days. Brittany Ferries said it had received a surge of bookings following the rule changes announced on Thursday, but travel agents said the relaxation of quarantine for one of the UK's most popular destinations came, quote, too late to save the summer. Travellers in Mexico had to rush back to avoid hotel quarantine. Under the latest changes to the UK's traffic light system for travel, the rules have been relaxed for a dozen countries. The footballer Lionel Messi was in tears at a news conference today as he said farewell to FC Barcelona, but said he has not yet decided on his future. Messi, who broke down as he received a standing ovation, said he tried to behave with humility and respect. And he said, "I hope that's the memory that will be left of me." Messi, 34, has spent his entire career at Barcelona, coming through the club's academy before going on to score 672 goals in 778 appearances after making his senior debut in 2003. Messi has been linked to a move to PSG in France. The Greek Prime Minister has talked of a nightmarish summer as forest fires continue to ravage the country. Thousands have been evacuated from their homes and more than 1,000 firefighters have been deployed to bring the flames under control. Greece is experiencing its worst heat wave in more than 30 years. Authorities have warned that the risk of further fires remains high in many regions, including Athens and Crete. Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis says the government's priority has been first and foremost to protect human lives. In the last 10 days, more than 140,000 acres have been burned in Greece. In dramatic scenes, residents and holidaymakers alike had to be ferried out of the island of Evia, the country's second largest, as all other escapes were blocked. Fires in Turkey have also killed at least 8 people, including a volunteer who was carrying drinking water and other refreshments to firefighters in Marmaris. New strains of the coronavirus could be named after constellations once the Greek alphabet is used up, a World Health Organization boss has suggested. Maria Van Kerkhove, the WHO's COVID-19 technical lead, also warned it is possible new variants could emerge which evade vaccines. The agency started naming new mutations after letters of the Greek alphabet back in May. So far, 11 variants have been named, including the Delta, Beta and Alpha strains. Researchers say they have established a clear link between the Euro 2020 football tournament and a rise in COVID-19 cases in Scottish men. 3 days after the England v Scotland match at Wembley Stadium in June, the coronavirus pandemic peaked in Scotland, with more than half of recorded cases having either attended a Euro 2020 event or having been in close contact with someone who had, according to Public Health Scotland. Overall, 90% of the recorded positive cases were men and 73% were between the ages of 20 and 39. The Taliban has captured the key northern Afghan city of Kunduz, one of the country's largest, after fierce fighting with government forces. A local official said all but the city's airport had fallen to the militants. The group's flag was seen raised above the city centre. Chaotic scenes have been reported with buildings and shops ablaze. 4 regional capitals have now fallen to the Taliban since Friday. Kunduz is their most important gain this year. The world is dangerously close to running out of time to stop a climate change catastrophe. The UK government's climate chief, Alok Sharma, has warned. Sharma, who is leading the COP26, the climate summit hosted in the UK in Glasgow this year, said the effects were already clear with floods, fires and heat waves. Quote, "We can't afford to wait years, 5 years, 10 years. This is the moment." He also defended his decision to travel to more than 30 countries in 7 months. A report from the United Nations climate change researchers is due tomorrow and will likely give details about how the world's oceans, ice caps and land will change in the next decades. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un has called on the military to carry out relief work in areas recently hit by heavy rain, state media reports. More than 1,000 homes were damaged and about 5,000 people evacuated after the ensuing flooding, state television reported earlier this week. The move comes amid concerns over an economic crisis and food shortages. Agricultural land has been damaged, and Kim Jong-un said in June that the country faced a tense food situation. Footage from the state-run KCTV showed homes flooded up to their roofs, as well as damaged bridges and railroads in the eastern province of South Hamgyong. It also said about 17 kilometres of roads and bridges had been damaged. And finally, it's not just famous for flat-pack furniture. The Swedish company IKEA is also known for the Swedish meatballs served at its stores' cafeterias. Now it's turning those meatballs customers love into scented candles. IKEA is offering the meatball scented candles as a prize in sweepstakes events for loyalty club members to celebrate the 10-year anniversary of the loyalty program. The company hopes that candles will entice additional customers to follow their nose and sign up for the card. 1,925 lucky winners will get to claim one of the meatball candles in the event, which runs until August the 22nd. Quote, "Staying at home can be hard," the company said, "but we want to help make everyone's lives that little easier and more enjoyable. Bon appetit, or smackling matlid, as we say in Sweden." And who knows what I just said there in Swedish, but that is the latest here on Sputnik News. I'm Jamie Lowe.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway. Only on Sputnik Radio.
Well, I don't know about you, but I thought that Iranian that was just on here, the eminent professor of American Studies, I thought that was one of the best conversations about Iran, America, Britain, Israel that I have seen or heard for a long time. They must be well off in Iran if he isn't the ambassador to the United Nations. He'd be very good for an international, wider international audience. I thought it was excellent. We'll do a special bonus on the podcast on that. We did it with our Chinese guest last week, and it went down very, very well. So thank you, Professor Mohammed. Will the US, UK right to pull out of Afghanistan? So far, it's A, yes, B, no, yes, 30%, no, 23%, and C, never have gone in the first place, 47%. So that is 77% say we were right to pull out or should never have gone in. 23% say we shouldn't be pulling out. You can still vote for the rest of this hour on my Twitter handle at George Galloway. Now, you may recall one of the most powerful interviews that I have done in the last few months was with the attorney Stephen Donziger, a brave man who stood up to Chevron, the oil company, and held them to account, caused the courts to hold them to account for billions of dollars. But he's the one that's ended up under arrest. You'll remember the last time we spoke to Stephen, he was awaiting an appeal against a quite incredible situation. He is not in jail, but a private company has gotten a court to hold him under house arrest. And he's now been under that house arrest for 2 years, I think. He joins us now in the wake of disappointing news, I think, Stephen, on the appeal. Perhaps you would describe it to us.
Thank you, George. It's good to be with you again. In a nutshell, I help indigenous peoples in Ecuador win a $9.5 billion pollution judgment against Chevron. The judgment's been affirmed by 6 appellate courts in Canada and Ecuador, including the Supreme Courts of both countries. Chevron refuses to pay, and they've enlisted a U.S. judge who's a former tobacco industry defense lawyer to target me. And I've been under house arrest now for 2 years. The longest sentence ever given a lawyer who's convicted of my supposed crime. The crime is contempt of court. I refuse to turn my computer over to Chevron. That's a longer story, but I'm well within my rights not to do so. The longest sentence ever given is 90 days of home detention. And today is my 733rd day of home detention. This is being driven by Chevron every step of the way. The judge who charged me, the tobacco industry lawyer, he had his charges rejected by the normal federal prosecutor here in New York. He then appointed a private law firm to prosecute me. He hid the fact that the law firm, Seward and Kissel, that's the name of the firm, had Chevron as a client. He didn't, the case wasn't assigned randomly as is normally required. He gave it to a friend of his, another judge who's a leader of the Federalist Society, which is a pro-corporate legal group in the United States funded by Chevron and other big fossil fuel companies. So I'm being surrounded by Chevron lawyers. They've essentially taken over the public function of prosecuting crime in my case. First time it's ever happened. It's a corporate prosecution. It's wrong. I'm begging the U.S. Department of Justice to take over the prosecution and stop this, what has essentially become a charade. My appeal is still outstanding. It hasn't really even started yet. The judge just convicted me without a jury, Judge Preska, Kaplan's friend, the charging judge's friend. She wouldn't let me testify on my behalf and tell my story. She read the newspaper during the trial. And it was a preordained conclusion she would find me guilty. We were not surprised. I believe I'm innocent. Most objective experts who look at this can't believe it's even happening. This all stems from legitimate litigation disputes I had in a civil case. But it's led to 2 years of house arrest. My anniversary of house arrest, the 2-year anniversary, was Friday, a couple days ago. And I'm really fortunate in this sense. There were rallies in 18 cities around the world for my release and to boycott Chevron until they release me. Bigger issue is we can't let the fossil fuel companies do this to people, to lawyers and human rights advocates and environmental defenders who are successful in holding the major polluters accountable. It's a new playbook. We can't let them get away with it, and I intend to keep fighting it.
So we have a household name, Chevron, not only refusing to pay fines that have been placed upon them by the lawful authorities in Ecuador, and going after the lawyer who exposed them, helped to expose them and convict them. And the US government is sitting idly by while all this is happening?
Well, yes. I mean, I can't understand how the responsible parties, the people in charge of criminal prosecution in this country, can let a private Chevron law firm prosecute its biggest critic. I mean, it's an embarrassment for the rule of law. It's a violation of the rule of law. It's an embarrassment for our country. Completely undermines the moral authority of the United States government to even talk about human rights issues in other countries. And we're calling on the Biden administration and the U.S. Department of Justice to stop this case, take it over, and prosecute me directly. Of course, I believe if that were to happen, they would dismiss the case for the obvious reason that the charges against me, we believe, are baseless. And even if I were guilty, which, again, I assert that I'm not, but let's assume for purposes of argument that I am, I've served 8 times the maximum sentence ever given to someone. So this is just a waste of resources, a waste of public resources. The Chevron law firm, by the way, has been paid about $1 million by taxpayers to prosecute me on a misdemeanor. Misdemeanor here is a very petty crime with a maximum sentence of 6 months in jail. It's a minor crime. And they've spent $1 million to prosecute me, paid by taxpayers, after the normal federal prosecutorial authorities rejected the case.
Well, what would happen, Stephen, if you just said, this is a joke, I'm no longer staying under house arrest? Who then would apprehend you?
The federal marshals, the police.
Even though it's not a federal court that is handling the case?
Well, so, the way this went down is the Chevron law firm, prosecuted me, went into the judge, who again is a Chevron-connected judge, and said, we want him locked up because we think he's a risk of flight. He'll go to Ecuador, which was just preposterous. I have a wife and son here, and I've never missed a court appearance, and they knew that was BS. but they used that as a pretext to lock me up. So the judge went along with it, and with the request of the Chevron law firm. But again, they're all kind of working together, in my opinion, to try to undermine the Ecuador pollution judgment and, weaponize me to intimidate other human rights activists. So they have every incentive to keep me locked up for as long as possible. It's actually quite scary.
And so are there marshals outside your door?
No. I mean, right now I'm complying and always have complied or done my absolute best to comply with my conditions, which includes staying in my home 24/7, other than a few times I go out with the permission of a court officer for things like legal meetings and medical appointments. So, the marshals are not here, and I don't expect them to be here because I'm complying with my conditions.
Have you thought about doing a runner somewhere?
Meaning running away?
Yeah. I mean, if I were you, I think I'd head to a friendly embassy or at least to the airport.
No.
Have they got your passport?
No, that's not how I roll. I mean, I understand what you're saying, but look, I'm a rule of law guy. I believe this is wrong. I'm not running away. We are confronting this, and we expect to correct this problem, both to save me and my family, but also to help protect the rule of law in the United States, because we don't want this happening again. So, I'm here, I'm complying with these orders, and ultimately the judges who are attacking me are not the ultimate deciders. It's going to a higher court real soon, and I expect them to give very quick relief.
Just remind us finally, how shocking were Chevron's crimes in Ecuador?
Probably the worst oil-related disaster in the history of the planet. They deliberately dumped 16 billion gallons of cancer-causing toxic oil waste into rivers and streams that were relied on by indigenous groups in the Amazon for their drinking water, for their fishing, for their bathing, for their sustenance. They polluted the air. They polluted the food supply. And these are indigenous groups that for millennia had lived prosperously in the rainforest with no money. I mean, they had everything they wanted or needed, including medicines and shelter and food and fish and, clean water, clean air. And in a few short years, Chevron, through its predecessor company, Texaco, went in and poisoned the whole area. It's a 1,500 square mile area. I emphasize this was not an accident. This was not like what BP did in the United States in the Gulf of Mexico. This was by deliberate design. This was a production system designed to pollute, to save $3 a barrel. And the people paying the price are the 5 indigenous nations who are barely hanging on and are facing extinction because they can no longer be supported by the forest in their traditional way of life, because the forest has been deliberately poisoned by Chevron. Having been held accountable in a court of law, by the way, the case was held in Ecuador at Chevron's request. They insisted the case be in Ecuador. They promised to comply with any adverse judgment. But once we got the judgment, they're like, oh, we're not paying. And they threatened the indigenous people with a lifetime of litigation unless they gave up on the case. And then there was an internal email we found. We're like, oh, our new defense strategy is to demonize Donziger, meaning me. They never want to talk about the merits of what they did. They never want to talk about the environmental crimes they committed, the mass industrial size poisoning of the rainforest by literally dumping 4 million gallons a day of scalding oil wastewater into rivers and streams with no warning to the people. They lied, the Chevron engineers lied to the indigenous leaders, saying that oil was like milk, it had vitamins. I mean, the level of abuse, George, is it's shocking. I mean, I know there's a lot of abusive behavior in the fossil fuel industry in Nigeria and many countries. But I have talked to a lot of oil workers who worked in dozens of countries around the world, and they say they have never seen anything as bad as what Chevron did in Ecuador.
It belongs in the drawer marked unbelievable. I found it difficult after our first interview to understand how this can be allowed to happen. I must say I feel even more so now. Stephen, the best of luck. When will we hear about the next appeal?
Yeah, I'll keep you posted. If people want to keep up with the case, follow me on Twitter at @SDonziger or on Instagram, Stephen Donziger. The other thing is we have a website, donzigerdefense.com, DONZIGER defense.com. Sign up, you'll get our email newsletter. And if you want to help financially, we have a defense fund. It does take resources to fight this monster. And if you can help, please do. But come anyway to the site, even if you can't, sign up and get involved. We're building a campaign out of this.
Now, are we spelling defense correctly or in the American way?
Oh, I'm sorry. The American way, the incorrect way. So it's Donziger, DEFENSE.
Thank you. Stephen, thank you very much. God bless you and protect you.
Thank you, George.
Very much indeed. Now, we're taking your calls after the break. You can call in to speak to me about that case, about the Andrew Cuomo case, about Iran. Let me remind you of the numbers. If you're in the UK, it's 08081 965522. If you're in the US, it's +1 844 944 3344. Now, have I got a question for you? The US dropped the second atom bomb on the Japanese city of Nagasaki in this week in 1945. What was that bomb called? A, Big Bertha, B, Long John, C, Fat Man. Answer after the break.
Radio Sputnik.
If you're in the United Kingdom, it's 08081965522. If you're in the United States, it's +1 844 944 3344. Let me hear from you.
I was just listening to your previous callers about the manufacturing of consent.
Yeah.
People are powerless. They're drowning in a cocktail of confusion and they just don't know what to do and they know no one's speaking up for them.
It's bristling out there amongst the white English working class. They feel that Labour hates them and they hate Labour back.
I think the idea of this capitalism thing that we have limited respect for, which is linked with freedom compared to like a strict socialist, people going on to welfare and not being able to work. And I feel like that almost the world, this great reset and build back better and all these key words that come out with country leaders all over the world, it seems to me to be a little bit worrying.
No, you shouldn't be any more worried than you were before. But you shouldn't be any less worried than you were before either.
If you're a lawyer, which unfortunately, what's his name? Keir Starmer is, he's spending all of his time being right about everything. You know, he can't appeal to every community. It's not good enough. It really isn't good enough. You know, there were 4 other candidates and they were all better than him.
Why has the Labour Party failed so miserably? I mean...
Well, the Labour Party has fallen out of love with the British people, and the British people have reciprocated.
Yeah, but don't you think Labour had some part to play in that, though, with the whole classism thing? I mean, like, you're supposed to be old Labour, like you went against new Labour, inverted commas. So don't you think it's on people like you to promote actual...
Well,
Labour policies or whatever?
No, why should I... What do I owe the Labour Party, Dan?
Labour Party or whatever.
I think the Labour Party is a catastrophic disaster. It has...
Do something about it then. Why are you complaining about it? Why don't you do something about it, right? Instead of complaining?
But Dan obviously doesn't know that I'm actually the leader of a rival political party and stand against the Labour Party in elections.
And George, do you know something else?
You're not going to sing again, are you?
For the last time you spoke to me, you ain't nothing but a hound dog, crying all the time. Well, you ain't never caught a rabbit. You ain't no friend of mine.
You've actually got a great voice.
Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
I forgot to give you the answer. The US dropped the second atom bomb on the Japanese city of Nagasaki, and the bomb was called Fat Man. They were joking about it, you know, as you do about a bomb that's going to incinerate scores of thousands of people in an instant. Just on the back of that Stephen Donziger interview, let's go to Tarif in New Orleans, who wants to talk about that. Tarif?
Thank you for taking my call, George. I'm glad you had Thank you for taking my call. First, I'd like to say free Julian Assange, hands off Haiti. I'm calling in support of Donziger. People, please support him. He have that's what they're doing to him is not right. They have other cases out there, such as Flint, Michigan, and Nigeria, and other places that need our help. Also, I'm calling to to ask him if he's listening to the show that I need representation because I have a case against the VA in Houston called Mikey D. Bacon in Houston Medical Center, which they had contaminated water themselves. And you never know, if I can get him as my lawyer, if I can raise money and get him as my lawyer, then we probably can find out all type of things besides contaminated water. And and hopefully I can donate to people in Flint, where we can go after the leaders in Flint, because they have people now in Flint have to get their throats worked on because the pipes were so erotic and so caustic. It was basically destroying people's esophagus, and had to get echotrotomies. I forgot your name, people got to eat through straws now in Flint, Michigan, because that's how bad it is, and it's like they've been left out in other cities and stuff.
It is truly extraordinary. We're talking about contaminated water in the United States of America. Thanks, Tarif, for that call. Let's go to Idaho, where Eve is on the line. Eve, welcome back.
Hello, George. Yes, I wanted to comment on the Iran situation. As you have heard, Kamala Harris is going to Vietnam with the message that America is back. It's not told if she will bring with her the movie of Oliver Stone, Platoon, to view it with the leader of Vietnam. But what it means is that intervention war are back, and America essentially has three potential fights to have. One in Ukraine against Russia, one in Taiwan against China, and one in the Middle East. If they have to take one, they will take the Middle East because it's still the weaker target. Iran is the weakest target of the three. So what Israel is saying when they say they are ready for war against Iran, of course they are not ready because they are not ready against Iran, they are not ready against Lebanon, they are not even ready against Hamas. But what they're telling you is that they are ready to make America fight against Iran. And that's why I'm very pessimistic.
How would you see that rolling out? What would be the casus belli?
Well, they can make a false flag, like a tanker or something like that. I don't believe that. See, where I kind of disagree with maybe your analysis is that what Israel wants is to involve America. That means they want to extend the war. So I don't think Iran, for instance, would attack, the United Arab Emirates or thing like that. The game of Israel would be to involve America, and that would solve for America a few problems. They would say, "Oh, okay, we can solve also the Syria problem, we can solve the Iraq problem." So
you really think the U.S. has the capacity to solve these things? I very definitely do not.
No, but they have. You see, I assume that they have been convinced to enter in one conflict, and their choice. So that's an assumption which may be wrong. But let's assume that. And they have the choice between three: Ukraine, Taiwan, or Iran. Which one would you pick? If the neocon have convinced the president that in order to save America, the reputation, America is back, all this rhetoric, they have the choice between the three, I would say that they pick Iran.
Well, picking any of them would be a very, very big mistake. The biggest mistake in history. Thanks, Eve, for that call. Bobby is in London on the same subject. Go ahead, Bob.
Good evening, Mr. Galloway. Great show and great man. I wanted to talk about the Iran and Israel. Probably a war will start. If that war will start, Mr. Galloway, it will be the end of the Gulf state.
I agree with that.
It will be completely the end. And I got a feeling, Mr. Galloway, I think Saudi Arabia and maybe United Arab Emirates are telling Israel not to go for war with Iran. And I am pretty certain Israel, they said, well, okay, we don't go for war. You need to pay us. Because it will be the end of this country if a war will break. The other things I wanted to talk about Tony Blair, a war criminal. I ask you, Mr. Galloway, probably you can help me about that. Why this war criminal who actually bullshitting, sorry about my word, Gulf state leader, and he made $1 million, and he's still at large. He never been arrested and taken to the Netherlands for his crime committed on a lie in Iraq. I just cannot understand. If that man is not going to be arrested and taken to the Hague, Mr. Galloway, I think somebody else will do it again because they said, well, Tony Blair, he done it, I can do it, and I go...
well, he didn't just get away with it, Bobby. Yeah. He became fantastically rich on the back of it.
Absolutely.
So there's no moral hazard, it seems, involving your country in an illegal and cataclysmically backfiring war. This war, if it had succeeded, none of us would be talking about it, and I wouldn't be in the position I'm in. I'd be finished long ago.
Mr. Galloway, I remember exactly what you told the British people in the world. Please don't listen to this man because he's an actor. He's telling a lie. He's telling a lie about Saddam Hussein, weapon of mass destruction. And finally, Mr. Galloway, this is very, very funny. Everybody is talking about. You know the people who actually, what is the word? Who actually killed Saddam Hussein, on that day. Everybody believe it, because their face are covered. Everybody believe they are Tony Blair and George Bush.
Well, not literally, of course, but metaphorically, that's
the
true.
People who executed Saddam Hussein.
Yeah, well, there was people acting on their behalf, but all of that has backfired. The blowback on it is still firing. The depth of the disaster has not yet been plumbed. My youngest child, 1 year today, her whole life will be overshadowed and influenced by...
Happy birthday to her,
Thank you.
Mr. Galloway.
Thank you, Bob. But her whole life will be affected by and overshadowed by the decisions made in 2003 by Tony Blair and George Bush. Thank you, Bobby, for that call. Saber says, George, great job with the film Killing Kelly. You have leveled up with everything from production to interview quality. I urge all to watch. Can't wait for your next film. care to drop any hints? No, I really don't know what the next film will be. I've got more than enough to do, Saber, to make this one a success. It started very strongly. It has been virtually unanimously, I haven't seen a single bad comment anywhere on any platform about the film. I think everyone thinks, thanks to the brilliance of our director, Sean Murray, I really think it is an extremely strong film. And it's very cheap. You can rent it for £4. You can buy it for £6.50. And in the next days, you'll be beginning to see delivered the DVDs signed for those that have paid for that and who are due it. And you'll be able to buy it on my shop. There it is there, georgegalloway.shop. But it started very well. I think it's going to run and run. This is a clip from it. I don't think a single person who's watched it was in any doubt at the end of it that the story we've been told about Dr. David Kelly is a falsehood. Everyone now knows, I think most people knew at the time, that whatever else happened to David Kelly, and we go into this in depth in the film, he did not commit suicide. At least he certainly did not commit suicide on Harrowdown Hill, where his body was found. Just think about that. Just think about that. If he didn't commit suicide, somebody faked the suicide of a man that had been on your television 2 days before. And if he didn't cut his wrist, who did cut it? What country are we in? What government did we have? What kind of a state are we in where a man like David Kelly can have a suicide faked in the English countryside? Think about that. And the people who bear responsibility for it, what happened to them? I'll tell you what happened to them. They're still in power, and they're filthy rich and still in power. Just think about that. Now, sorry, my blood was up there. Now, I've done that one. Let me go to, in 1982, the Cray twins, Ronnie and Reggie, were let out of prison for their mother's funeral. What was the third brother called? Was it Barney? Was it Charlie? Or was it Rudy? Answer after the break.
Nick.
We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
The airwaves. This savannah is a rigid dichotomy of fact and fiction. As Fisher says, the Twitter sphere where the slightest misjudgment can spell being cancelled. One species rules over the airwaves through its ability to adapt and survive in even the harshest environments. The George Galloway. The top cat in these parts, it is mostly active on Sunday evenings in Britain and mid-afternoon in the United States. It seldom roars during the day. Most notable for its wide variety of headdress, it protects these parts from the mainstream media. You can catch this fine specimen on the mother of all talk shows. Don't pick a fight with it, They've been known to bite back.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
The mother of all talk shows. Join our faculty of legends, contributors, and callers. Everyone is welcome.
And the answer, of course, was Charlie Cray. Now, will the US-UK right to pull out of Afghanistan? Yes, 29%. No, 23%. Never have gone in, 48%. You got 5 minutes left to vote on that poll on my Twitter feed. Let me do some more social media. Forgive me, those that are waiting to get online. Gado says the US empire is in decline. Hard for middle-aged white men to come to grips with that fact. I've come to grips with it. The Donziger case shows just how dystopian the US political situation is, says NSPK. Amen. And Rick says, George, we demand universal basic income. UBI, Labour and Tory. Both parties don't want that. And emails. Tom says, what a truly enlightening interview with the professor from Iran. Moats really is the college of knowledge. Oh, and happy birthday to Oban. Thank you very much, Tom. Most kind. And it was indeed, I thought, a brilliant interview. Not anything to do with me, but with the interviewee. Frank says, Donziger's story is tragic. Mine is far more complex. I've been fighting a compensation case for over 8 years in the Egyptian courts. I'm fighting a corrupt judiciary, and it's against the Egyptian Maintenance Company. Thanks, Frank. Sorry for your troubles. I wouldn't like to be in front of Egyptian justice either. And Chris says, do you think Boris will let the universal credit uplift end, extend it, or make the uplift permanent? The media has been largely asleep on this impending disaster. Not asleep, Chris. They don't give a monkeys about it. And SS says, so Cuomo gets done for sexual harassment, but gets away with murdering the elderly. Well, they got Capone on tax evasion. Pikachu says, from smallpox blankets to uranium-depleted munitions, and now SARS-CoV-2, the US leads the way in the world in biochemical warfare. And Nico says, now China is the new target of the West, after the West pulls out of Afghanistan and its neighboring nations. And Mitch says the only thing that's changed is the West has spent billions on nothing but pain. Bin Laden was there helping America get rid of the Russians. First he was a freedom fighter, then he was a terrorist. Abel Malcolm says, I think the Chinese will handle Afghanistan perfectly. They'll do a win-win business deal where everyone benefits. No bombings, no killings. Let's take a couple of calls. Sarkar is in Glasgow. Go ahead, Sarkar. Welcome back.
Thank you so much, George, for taking my call. First of all, happy birthday to your little one, or as they say, the wee one in Scotland.
Thank you.
George, my question is with relations to Nicola Sturgeon. First of all, I must say I don't agree with any of her policies, but credit must go to her. So far, she has been fooling her opponents. Now she has been fooling her supporters. The COVID management in Scotland was one of the worst. And on top of that, Nicola Sturgeon, we know what happened with the independent funds which were raised for independence, that one of our own MSPs who got selected from East Dunbartonshire, he resigned in a space of few days after winning the election. And now Nicola Sturgeon, who likes to act like this climate champion, who literally, that's why I say she has been fooling her own supporters now. Just today, she has done a deal with Shell in North Sea oil, so oil can be extracted. So she fools people on climate, she fools people on COVID. I personally think, George, of course, I'll take your expert opinion, she does not know what to do with independence if she gets it.
No,
she's keeping on stirring the fire, but she does not know what to do with it.
The fool is us, Sarkar. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. She has fooled us, but the fools are us. How they could possibly have been re-elected to power, albeit as another minority government, in the face of all of the evidence, can only be explained in two ways. Widespread stupidity, myopia, mass hysteria, and the utterly pitiful standard of her opposition.
Absolutely,
and I don't know which of the two is the greater contributory factor. Last word to
Absolutely,
you.
George, and see the drug deaths. Like you've got Scottish roots, you're from Dundee or Fife region, if I'm not mistaken. Scottish drug deaths are one of the worst in Europe. 10 years they have been in power, first with Alex Salmond, now with Nicola Sturgeon since 2014. Health, police, media, everything, legal system is devolved. And they still make a total mess of that. Whom will they blame on the drug deaths? Will they blame Westminster again? Or will they ever raise their hands up and say, listen, folks, we made a mistake, we're going to change our course?
Well, thanks for that call. I come from Dundee, which is the drug death capital of Scotland. Scotland is the drug death capital of Europe. Just think about that. Scotland, the drug death capital of Europe. Dundee, the drug death capital of Scotland. Let's go to Dimitrios in Chicago. Go ahead, Dimitrios.
Hi, George. I've spoken with you before. I'm the guy who, I don't expect you to remember me, but I'm the guy who goes on the internet and sends messages about China and Russia, hopefully, but I keep getting censored. But
Oh, yeah, I remember you told us. Yeah, go ahead. You're not censored here.
I'm calling you, and this is a call I don't want to make, and this is a call I don't want to tell you about, but I have to because I saw a report. MIT did a study from 1973, and a few days ago they came out and said everything they said about this report, this study, has come true. And the conclusion is that by 2040, the human species will not be on this planet. We will be extinct. And I looked for it twice, just in case, right before I called you.
I don't know if other people
sure.
are hearing Dimitrios, but I'm not. So let me go on to Lee in London on that Chevron case. Lee, welcome. You're a first-time caller, and so you're particularly welcome. What would you like to say?
Thank you. Firstly, happy birthday.
Thank you.
To your beautiful girl. And
Thank
secondly, this interview you did with Donziger, I missed his first interview, which you've done. So I'm really glad you had him on again. I had no idea about the kind of details, the way he's described it about the case, and I think it's really helpful to share that. It just strikes me as to not only how corrupt the legal system is in America, but they're really trying to make an example of him, to use him as a deterrent to any other lawyer who chooses to go after a big established American organization, which I think is disgusting, because then we have no even playing. There's no kind of rule of law. It's just we will do what we want. If we want to go out there and kill, people in the Amazon rainforest, it's fine. Their life is cheap. We will dump all our toxic waste there. We will trial all our drugs there. I mean, I really think I personally am going to get behind this campaign, and I'm really glad that I kind of heard his interview on your show. So thank you for having him on there.
Well, I think this is a story that is scandalously underreported. I mean, why isn't every liberal, every Guardian reader, every Green, every Labourite, Corbynite, why isn't everyone up in arms about this?
Well, I actually tweeted earlier today, funnily enough, I didn't know he was going to be on your show, and I tweeted earlier today that why aren't the UK media reporting on this? After his interview on your show, I tweeted about him again, and I just done a quick Google, and The Guardian reported on him, but it is sickening the way The Guardian reported it. A while ago, it was all about, I don't even want to repeat the way The Guardian reported it. So in a way, I'm kind of glad the British media, your establishment media here, are not picking it up. But you're right. The Corbynites, the kind of liberals, we should be out there on the streets You know, he
incredible.
talked about all these protests and marches that happened in support of him. They were not in the UK, from what I know.
No, my experience is that virtually nobody knows him. We're the only people that have properly showcased this story. And yet it's a story that's got everything. It's got the ugly American multinational company behaving as we all imagine ugly American multinational companies operate. It's got the corrupt judge concealing her connection to Chevron. It's got a splendidly liberal, square-jawed, brave American lawyer standing up to them. It's got Hollywood written all over it, this story. And yet, nobody knows about it, Lee.
And he's stuck at home 2 years, and he's only, I mean, when we were in lockdown, we were at least allowed an hour a day for a walk. Even in prison, you're allowed an hour a day for exercise. The guy is only allowed to go out for medical treatment or lawyers, and that's it. So what are they trying to do, kill him by default? It's shocking that he's not even allowed to leave his home. He's got a wife and child. The impact on him, his life, his family, and, you know, hats off to him. You know, he's come on there, he sounds strong, he's determined. You asked him if he had his passport, he didn't answer that, I noticed, but he said, I'm going to stay and I'm going to fight this. And I feel it's good that he's staying and fighting this. I can't help but think that he's a bit more hopeful.
Yeah, exactly. If it was me, I'd be in the Russian embassy right now, but that's another matter.
He's a bit optimistic considering what's happened to him, that he's going to get justice very soon. So let's see, fingers crossed. But thank you so much for having him on, John, and it'll be interesting, George.
Wonderful,
it'll be interesting to see.
A wonderful
what happens
call,
with
Lee.
his appeal.
Don't be a stranger. That was the best first call that I've ever heard. Thank you very much for it. Walter says, free Mordechai Vanunu. Amen to that. And Abel says, Iran understands America. America does not understand Iran. America is blinded and derailed from reality due to Israeli meddling in America's elections. And Bill Maui says, great guest, George. This man is brilliant. That's Professor Marandi, and I agree with that. And Jose says, some drop bombs, others enter through the main door with projects. And Carlos says, nope, China is moving in, but not with weapons, but commerce. And Carl says the congressional media military-industrial complex doesn't care whether an invasion succeeds or not. The war machine is a for-profit operation, the success of which is only measured by profit gained. And this is a good one from Tony. Might be worth reminding Moats viewers that Craig Murray is rotting in prison for revealing less about a Scottish court case than has already been aired in public about Cuomo. A very good point, Tony, and my deepest sympathies and solidarity to Craig Murray, still behind bars. Another Tony, this time, Andrew Cuomo and Hunter Biden should both be in jail already. It seems the DOJ turns the other cheek when it comes to their own. And that same Tony says, Iran has a huge number of ballistic missiles with a range up to 2,000 kilometers and is the world's 5th largest drone power, jet and piston powered. The Americans know how powerful Iran really is. And Frank says, hi George, I met Mr. Biggs in 1982 when I was working in Brazil. Long, strange story. We'd love to hear it, Frank. Call us up and tell us. And Syra says, Israel has said, when, not if we attack Iran. She has been saying this for years. It's a nightmare. And Johnny says, Israel will never be ready for war with Iran. That moment has long passed. And NSPK on climate change says, not to mention that the Middle East will be utterly unlivable in the near term thanks to climate crisis. Not that Gigi will ever mention that here. Mentioned! Claude says the two biggest drivers of climate change are human overpopulation and capitalism. George, you're a socialist, an internationalist. Encouraging the British to make more babies is lunacy. Claude, the entire population of Britain could stand shoulder to shoulder on the Isle of Wight. Our country is largely empty. We need children because we have an aging population, and most British people don't want mass immigration. That leaves only one option, and it happens to be the most delightful option. Make babies. Go forth. Multiply. I've done my bit. I can do no more. I'll be back after the news with Jamie Lowe.
The mother of all talk shows. The only education you can get for free.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Radio Sputnik News.
The COVID-delayed 2020 Olympics in Tokyo have closed, with athletes parading in the closing ceremony. At the end of the ceremony, the Olympic flag was handed over to Paris, where the Games are to be held in 2024, and the Olympic flames extinguished. Digital signs displayed arigato, which is thank you in Japanese. The United States came top of the medal table with 113 in total. China was the second most successful nation. Team GB was fourth with 65 medals, 22 gold, 21 silvers and 22 bronze. Fully vaccinated people can now visit France without quarantining on their return to Britain after travel rule changes came into force earlier today. France moved on to the amber list, which means children and fully vaccinated passengers do not have to quarantine on their return, although unvaccinated travellers still have to self-isolate at home for 10 days. Brittany Ferries said it had received a surge of bookings following the rule changes announced on Thursday, but travel agents said the relaxation of quarantine for one of the UK's most popular destinations came, quote, too late to save the summer. Travellers in Mexico had to rush back to avoid hotel quarantine. Under the latest changes to the UK's traffic light system for travel, the rules have been relaxed for a dozen countries. The footballer Lionel Messi was in tears at a news conference today as he said farewell to FC Barcelona, but said he has not yet decided on his future. Messi, who broke down as he received a standing ovation, said he tried to behave with humility and respect, and he said, "I hope that's the memory that will be left of me." Messi, 34, has spent his entire career at Barcelona, coming through the club's academy before going on to score 672 goals in 778 appearances after making his senior debut in 2003. Messi has been linked to a move to PSG in France. The Greek Prime Minister has talked of a nightmarish summer as forest fires continue to ravage the country. Thousands have been evacuated from their homes and more than 1,000 firefighters have been deployed to bring the flames under control. Greece is experiencing its worst heat wave in more than 30 years. Authorities have warned that the risk of further fires remains high in many regions, including Athens and Crete. Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis says the government's priority has been first and foremost to protect human lives. In the last 10 days, more than 140,000 acres have been burned in Greece. In dramatic scenes, residents and holidaymakers alike had to be ferried out of the island of Evia, the country's second largest, as all other escapes were blocked. Fires in Turkey have also killed at least 8 people, including a volunteer who was carrying drinking water and other refreshments to firefighters in Marmaris. New strains of the coronavirus could be named after constellations once the Greek alphabet is used up, a World Health Organization boss has suggested. Maria Van Kerkhove, the WHO's COVID-19 technical lead, also warned it is possible new variants could emerge which evade vaccines. The agency started naming new mutations after letters of the Greek alphabet back in May. So far, 11 variants have been named, including the Delta, Beta and Alpha strains. Researchers say they have established a clear link between the Euro 2020 football tournament and a rise in COVID-19 cases in Scottish men. 3 days after the England v Scotland match at Wembley Stadium in June, the coronavirus pandemic peaked in Scotland, with more than half of recorded cases having either attended a Euro 2020 event or having been in close contact with someone who had, according to Public Health Scotland. Overall, 90% of the recorded positive cases were men and 73% were between the ages of 20 and 39. The Taliban has captured the key northern Afghan city of Kunduz, one of the country's largest, after fierce fighting with government forces. A local official said all but the city's airport had fallen to the militants. The group's flag was seen raised above the city centre. Chaotic scenes have been reported with buildings and shops ablaze. 4 regional capitals have now fallen to the Taliban since Friday. Kunduz is their most important gain this year. The world is dangerously close to running out of time to stop a climate change catastrophe. The UK government's climate chief, Alok Sharma, has warned. Sharma, who is leading the COP26, the climate summit hosted in the UK in Glasgow this year, said the effects were already clear with floods, fires and heat waves. Quote, "We can't afford to wait years, 5 years, 10 years. This is the moment." He also defended his decision to travel to more than 30 countries in 7 months. A report from the United Nations climate change researchers is due tomorrow and will likely give details about how the world's oceans, ice caps and land will change in the next decades. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un has called on the military to carry out relief work in areas recently hit by heavy rain, state media reports. More than 1,000 homes were damaged and about 5,000 people evacuated after the ensuing flooding, state television reported earlier this week. The move comes amid concerns over an economic crisis and food shortages. Agricultural land has been damaged, and Kim Jong-un said in June that the country faced a tense food situation. Footage from the state-run KCTV showed homes flooded up to their roofs, as well as damaged bridges and railroads in the eastern province of South Hamgyong. It also said about 17 kilometres of roads and bridges had been damaged. And finally, it's not just famous for flat-pack furniture. The Swedish company IKEA is also known for the Swedish meatballs served at its stores' cafeterias. Now it's turning those meatballs customers love into scented candles. IKEA is offering the meatball scented candles as a prize in sweepstakes events for loyalty club members to celebrate the 10-year anniversary of the loyalty program. The company hopes that candles will entice additional customers to follow their nose and sign up for the card. 1,925 lucky winners will get to claim one of the meatball candles in the event, which runs until August the 22nd. Quote, "Staying at home can be hard," the company said, "but we want to help make everyone's lives that little easier and more enjoyable. Bon appetit, or smakling matlid, as we say in Sweden." And who knows what I just said there in Swedish, but that is the latest here on Sputnik News. I'm Jamie Lowe.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway. Only on Sputnik Radio.
2 big stars coming up in the final hour. We have Rachel Blevins and Rania Khalek. How's that for a double bill? Our Patrick Christys has gone on to local television. He's now got a job at GB News. We wish him, of course, all the best, and I hope it was a good career move to go from global to local. we'll soon see. Now, that poll is closed. Will the US, UK right to pull out of Afghanistan? Over 2,000 people voted. Yes, 29%. No, 23%. Never have gone in, 48%. But there was also, of course, voting on other platforms. And the greater of those was on the YouTube platform. So 911 people voted. And the results were similar, but stronger. 35% said that we were right to pull out. Only 10% said that we were wrong. And 54% said we should never have gone in. And by the way, on the podcast, 4 times as many people have downloaded last week's podcast while we've been on the air. Thank you for that. We're now in the top 100 podcasts in Britain, political podcasts that is, and there are thousands and thousands of those. So for something that only started a few weeks ago, big thanks to the people who are working on that, particularly young Simon, a rising star. I don't want to boost him too much in case he ends up going to local television somewhere as well. That's the thing, you see. You bring on all this talent and they go down to local local media. Now, the one and only Rachel Blevins is up next. Rachel, as always, a warm welcome to you from London. We were talking earlier to one of your compatriots about the Andrew Cuomo story. I won't repeat everything there. I want to examine, if you like, the bigger picture. Is it possible that what Cuomo is alleging, which is that he's a victim of a political carve-up, that his rivals for his job and rivals in the Democratic Party have conspired against him? Or is that just flailing around looking for someone else to blame?
You know, George, I think it's interesting that that has been his immediate response, because so often whenever accusations come out like this, the person who is being accused immediately says, "That's it, I resign, I'm done here." But Andrew Cuomo has really stuck to his guns on this one and insisted that he's innocent. And now we're starting to hear more of the claims from the women who say that they were victims in all of this. We're starting to see their faces and hear these stories. And I mean, the stories are incredibly bothersome when you hear of these women saying that they were groped by Cuomo in the workplace, saying that he was abusing his power. And it is one of those cases where, you know, of course, yes, you have a situation where you have a he said, she said on it. It looks like he's going to stick to his guns on it. But it is incredibly notable that we have this report from New York's Attorney General saying that they interviewed hundreds of people who said that, yes, Cuomo was in violation of state and federal law when it came to his conduct within the workplace. And it also is notable here that this is the same Attorney General who also called out Cuomo earlier this year when it came to how the state was handling COVID cases, specifically in nursing homes. And I think if there were any way that his political opponents were going to try to go after him and get him out of office, it would have been with a case like that, when you had the state of New York allowing residents to go into nursing homes after they had tested positive for COVID-19. You had staff in those nursing homes who said that they were told that they could be fired or that they could be retaliated against in other ways if they didn't show up to work, even when they were sick. And so I think this is the kind of person who, whenever it comes to whatever his political opponents may have tried to get against him, they could have had a lot more before this report came out.
Sure, but this is eerily familiar because in Scotland, the Scottish government did exactly what Cuomo did. They sent people with COVID into care homes where those care homes were simply incapable of, unable to defend the other people in the care home or the staff of the care home, and thousands died and there will have to be a court case about that. But maybe the uncomfortable truth is that dead old people is less important in certain circles than Me Too allegations of grotesque behavior by a man against women.
Yeah, that is true. And that is incredibly unfortunate that we live in a day and age where, especially when it comes to the media coverage, because I mean, the same media that spent months showing all of Cuomo's briefings and talking about how wonderful he was and how great he was and how he should have been the president at a time when, of course, Trump was in office. And they just sang Cuomo's praises nonstop, and they acted like he could do no wrong. And now all of a sudden they're kind of turning the tide and saying, oh, well, listen to all of these accusers. Let's give them all the airtime. Now, I'm glad that they're giving them the airtime if that's the case, that they're finally speaking out. But at the same time, it also serves to remind you just exactly what the media does and how they treat those news cycles, and how, of course, they're not going to admit any wrong in any of this, you know, whenever it comes to their coverage of Cuomo over the last year.
Yeah, they built Cuomo up as a presidential hopeful. His brother, who's very thick with him and works with him, not just as a brother, but as a colleague, and works with him in many ways, is a big CNN talk show host. Cuomo was a liberal dream boy, poster boy. Are the liberals embarrassed at all?
I mean, I think the liberals are going to be embarrassed about just about anyone that's in a number of positions in their party at the moment, because they don't seem to quite have any direction when it comes to, you look at Biden, you look at Kamala Harris, and you look at the fact that the only reason that these people got public support was because they were anti-Trump. They weren't Trump. And I think that's kind of what it brings it back to when you look at the media's love fest with Cuomo over the last year. Well, it's because you had Donald Trump in the White House. They didn't really want to talk about him. They wanted to criticize him. So then they bring in Cuomo and put the attention on him. And so I think it serves as a reminder that, look, past Trump, the Democrats really haven't put up any hopefuls who would actually be able to win the White House. And that should be a problem for them. That should be something that they're focusing on. But instead, at the moment, they seem to just be focusing on the fact of, look, we have all these people. They all aren't great, but they're not Donald Trump.
Yeah, that's a wasting asset, in my opinion. The longer Trump is out of office, the more inevitably people will start to look at the people who actually are in power, and that isn't a good look. I don't know if you've seen the video that the rest of us have over here, was quite big, of President Biden this very week getting up to his old tricks with a young girl in front of the White House and the world's media. He's behaving in a way to a young girl, which if he did to my daughter, I would knock his block off. I would punch him and tear my daughter away from him. Although you've got to ask, why do people keep serving up their kids to Joe Biden? Do the American people have any idea how bad this all looks?
Oh, I agree with you 100%. And you really asked the question of, where are these kids' parents? Because this is not the first time that we've seen him completely invading the public space of a young child, acting inappropriate around a young child. And it seems like none of the other adults are around to say or do anything. And yet he's still allowed to continue to do that. And I think that's part of the problem, that we live in a country where everything is so politicized, because I remember when these past videos came out, when Biden was on the campaign trail, a lot of people said, no, that's just old, or they just shrugged it off, or they didn't seem to care about it. And they came back to the fact of, oh, well, one, Biden's a Democrat, two, he's not Trump. And I think, as you said, it needs to come to the time where we actually start looking at who these leaders are in office, and we start wondering why they all seem to be so morally corrupt. I mean, Biden himself has sexual assault allegations against him. You know, we've seen him in videos with these young children. Why is this what ends up becoming the American leadership in this country? That's something that I think that the American people really need to have a reckoning with and understand, because it's not okay on any level.
He says he's going to run again. That would mean that he would finally, if he won, he'd finally leave office at the ripe age of 86. Young Donald Trump is the youth candidate up against him if he runs. I see that Spicer, former press guy, has said that Trump is definitely going to run next time. He's waiting for the results of the midterms to tee up a relaunch. He's already raised over $100 million. His candidate just won the Republican nomination in the state of Ohio. It looks as if it's game on, doesn't it, Rachel?
It certainly seems that way. And, I think it's interesting because what also happened this week is that the Biden administration is really trying right now to pass this $1 trillion infrastructure package. And this is a package that really no one's happy with it because Republicans argue that it's not all infrastructure funding, even though it's got funding for roads, bridges, internet access, that sort of thing. The Democrats aren't really happy with it because they say that it leaves out a number of things, and they're going to then put up a $3.5 trillion infrastructure package, what they refer to as human infrastructure, soon after this one. However, what's notable at about this specific package, is that Trump has come out in opposition to it, and he's specifically told Republicans who support it that could backfire on you in the years to come. He's warned Republicans not to support this deal because it's the Biden administration's deal, but also because a number of Republicans already have. And so Trump is kind of in a place right now of testing how much control he still has over the Republican Party. And I think what you mentioned is a great point, which is it's like, look, Trump has already raised so many millions of dollars. He's going to continue to raise money going forward. And that's why the GOP at the end of the day will continue to support him. They may not like him, but they know where their paycheck is coming from. They know that he brings in the money. And so, yeah, we could see another race between these exact two candidates once again. And what's interesting is that there was a recent poll that came out that showed that the majority of Americans didn't want Trump to run. And I think a lot of that comes back to the fact that at the end of the day, if Trump runs, they think that it's going to be a lot more political bickering, which is what we've already seen. But at the end of the day, for the GOP and the Democratic Party, they see that as a win for them, because if people are bickering back and forth between these two political candidates, they're not looking at the policies they're presenting, and they're not looking at the policies that the Biden administration or the previous Trump administration has actually managed to follow through on. Those campaign promises that they swore they would get done that went by the wayside and never actually got fulfilled.
Finally, and I'm grateful, Rachel, as always, for your time, the scuttle out of Afghanistan has had a predictable result. The Taliban are on the march. I see just on the news there, a minute ago, they now say they control the Kunduz province. It won't be long before they're in Kabul, firing in the air and dealing with their erstwhile enemies. Are the American people prepared for that, do you think?
It's interesting to see the response to that, because this is something you've been saying is going to happen for years. This is something you and I have talked about on this show, which is that the Taliban, even in the last few years, has been more powerful than at any point since the U.S. invaded, which means that the U.S. actually helped them to become more powerful than ever before. And yet so many of the American people, I think they don't even realize just what a catastrophe this has been. They didn't even realize likely that the United States was still in Afghanistan, still fighting a war against this group. And so what's interesting is that typically in a case like this, you would have a number of, very out and about neocons here in the U.S. calling for the United States military to go in and to take on the Taliban. And you know why they're not doing that right now? Because over the last 20 years, they have been reminded that that isn't possible unacceptable, and that the U.S. has lost so severely that even the war lovers here in the U.S. aren't calling for them to go back in and to create another war because they know that it has been an absolute failure. But I think we also have to remember that the less we talk about it, the less we talk about just how many war criminals in the U.S. political class need to be held accountable for what they did in this country. And for 20 years of knowing that they weren't going to win a war, knowing that they were fueling corruption in this country, and yet they did it anyway, and they still have faced no consequences for it.
Rachel Blevins, as always, brilliant. Thank you very much for joining us on the mother of all talk shows. Just imagine if you were the widow of, or the mother or father of, one of the thousands of soldiers that left their lives, their limbs, their blood in the sand in Afghanistan. Wouldn't you be asking the people that sent them there why? What this was all about? Imagine being the last man to die in the Bush and Blair war in Afghanistan. Just think about that. The second poll is running now. Boris Johnson, a man who speaks Latin better than President Trump spoke English, has decreed apparently that Latin should be back in schools. So we're asking, should Latin be taught in schools? A, yes. B, no. C, ego sum non certus. You can vote on my Twitter feed. Let's hear from Scott in Glasgow. Go ahead, Scott.
Yes, hello, George. Hello, George. Right, I'll get straight to it. I'm the tour driver of some well-known bands, and I was due to take them to some festivals. A few of them they're headlining. Some big festivals over Britain, the UK actually.
Yeah.
Now, within a few days of me leaving, festival policy, the particular festivals I was driving them to, festival policy changed, and you could only enter the grounds if you were jabbed. Now, you know, what we've got at the moment here, right, is a track and trace app that doesn't track or trace.
Yeah.
We've got a test that doesn't test. We've got a vaccine that doesn't vaccinate. Yeah? The last 18 months have been a military-grade psychological warfare operation on the planet. Not just one country, the whole planet. Military-grade psycho and psychological warfare program on us.
It's
now,
a funny program, though, Scott. It's a funny program that has the support of Kim Jong-un in North Korea, Vladimir Putin in Russia, the government in China, and the government of America and Britain. Why would they all be involved in a psychological war when they are, in fact, enemies?
Well, because they're all friends of the one thing, and that's power. That's what unites all corrupt people, power, and the wanting of more power. So if you ask me why have they all suddenly come together, they all want more power.
Really? So the power to require you to be vaccinated, delivering from your van in a park where a band is going to play at a festival. That's the kind of power they crave.
Well, I mean, we could break it down into that. Now, the festival policy changed, but we know that that's going to happen. For me personally, that was a chance that was going to happen on the 1st of September. But the policy changed, and my job is at risk. My business is at risk.
Why don't you get jabbed? Why don't you get jabbed, Scott?
Right, I'll tell you why, George. I'll tell you why, George. Because the CDC came out a couple of days ago, and they said not the viral load, but the viral kind of viral load in your nose and your mouth is exactly the same from the vaccinated to the unvaccinated. It's untested. I mean, there's another 2 years. You look on Pfizer's page.
Yeah, of course it's untested. It was introduced to deal with an emergency. Yeah, I know. I've heard all that. And frankly, you're not going to persuade me of all that. So I'm asking you a basic question.
Yeah.
Are you saying that you will go into bankruptcy, you will no longer be able to do your job, rather than get the vaccine?
I would. Now, I will give my life to stop my kids getting jabbed with this. Yeah, my oldest has already had it. My youngest, that's a hill I will die on in every sense of the word. This is not a vaccine, George. You look at the Collins Dictionary, you look at the...
It's a vaccine.
It's not a vaccine.
It's a vaccine.
It doesn't stimulate immunity.
Scott, I've heard all this bonkers.
It's not bonkers,
sophistry
George.
Before. It is a vaccine. It has not been tested. It's
not a vaccine.
I've had 2 vaccinations of it.
No, you haven't had 2 vaccinations. You've had 2 injections of something. You haven't had 2 vaccinations. You've had 2 injections of something.
What?
Which
Can
even
you
the
not find something more worthwhile to get so irate about?
What? Having children?
No, we're not talking about children. We're talking about you. You're a grown, hairy-arsed man that is ready to give up your job, put your family into penury, rather than get an injection that 88% of us have had. I think that is bonkers. I think you are bonkers. You need to get a grip of yourself. You need to find something more worthwhile to do. There's war, famine, pestilence, disease, poverty, corruption, right-wing rule, dictatorship, and you are infatuated by an injection. Clear off, mate. Should Latin be taught in schools? Yes, 39%. No, 53%. C, ego sum non certus, 8%. If you, like me, have absolutely no idea what that third option actually means, you can, of course, look it up in a dictionary. Now, in 1908, Henry Ford's company built the first Model T car, the first affordable one, and one which would transform travel. What was its nickname? This is a hard one. Was it A, Old Liz, B, Tin Lizzie, or C, Liz T? Answers after the break.
Radio Sputnik.
Tom says after independence we could choose the government we want. Tom, could you not have called me and argued that nonsense? Couldn't you? What's wrong with you, man? You've had the vaccine. Go ahead.
When I came out, I went into a boxer's stance and started doing a jig. And an old fella said, "Hey, have you just had that vaccine?" I said, "Aye." And he said to his wife, "Come on, love, you better get me one of them." He said, "And make me dance."
So you're full of life. And Ben says, could Scotland actually do better autonomously? Like I want California to secede. But I think we'd thrive if not burdened by the rest of the US. How very revealing of you, Ben. How utterly revealing of you. And Philip says, how any Labour or Tory supporter has the nerve to say the SNP are corrupt is beyond me. Why do you people not have the guts to call up instead of cowering behind one single name on social media?
There's a lot of people in Bradford who won't be taking this antivirus due to religious grounds.
Simon, what do you mean by religious grounds?
Religious grounds, I mean, many Muslims, for example, have issues with regards to this vaccine. Certain things.
Tell me what issues? What issues?
Well, for example, pork.
What does pork have to do with this vaccine?
You're kind of, again, you're clouding the issue here. There's the religious...
I'm not clouding the issue. You said pork.
Of course
you said pork.
No, but
Simon,
there's other things which
Simon,
are probably...
are you yourself a Muslim?
It doesn't matter whether I am or not.
It does, because you are purporting. No, it does.
It's justified for people to ask that.
Be quiet for a moment, please.
No, I won't. It's justified
Well, you will, because I'll turn your volume down. This is dangerous, reckless, ignorant, and potentially fatal nonsense. Get out of my sight and don't come back.
Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
The answer was that Henry Ford's company built the first Model T car in 1908, and it was nicknamed Tin Lizzie. Who knew? Long before Tin Lizzie, as some of us know it. The poll is going far better than I expected. Should Latin be taught in schools? Yes, 39%. No, 53%. Ego sum non certus, 8%. And on Telegram, it's similar. 32% yes, 47% no, and 21% ego sum non certus. Who knew? Now, I've got the one and only Rania Khalek coming up to talk about Lebanon exactly a year after the devastating explosion there. Still unexplained, still no accountability for those responsible for the, at best, negligence on an epic scale that led to this. Still no compensation, still no proper rebuilding of a devastated city. It was the biggest explosion, short of a nuclear explosion, that the world has ever seen. Just think about that. On top of all that, Lebanon's economic crisis has now reached the stage where people are hungry. The currency has lost a huge percentage of its value. The corrupt of the earth who reduced Lebanon to all of this have fled, have escaped back to their patrons, by and large. No one has faced trial for the mismanagement and theft of Lebanon's resources. And on top of all that, of course, on the anniversary of the war in 2006, Israel is bombing Lebanon again. Rania Khalek, highly polished journalist, presenter, and writer, enormously popular. Her broadcasts looked for all across the world, will be joining me in just a few seconds. Rania will be able to tell us about the corruption, about the explosion. It's almost like a mushroom cloud, that explosion. It's almost nuclear in its vision. The shockwave, can you just imagine it? Have we got Rania yet? We're still connecting to her. We're going to redial her. Should Latin be taught in schools? I've got no particular problem about it. Latin is the base of many European languages. It is used often in literature and in the law. I've got no particular animus against it, but it would probably be better for our children to learn Chinese or to learn Arabic or to learn Spanish, language which is studied, spoken rather, all across the world. I would have thought it's second in the European languages in terms of its reach. We're having difficulty with Rania, but we'll get her, I promise. Now, Richard Pearson says Latin doesn't really have a purpose in this day and age, a bit like Gaelic. And Barbara Lindsay says, I'm sure Miss Snuffy could help with this question poll, but I'm thinking that Latin has connections with law, medicine, science, music, theology, philosophy, art, and literature So I answered yes. And Thomas says it's absolutely useless for working class people, irrelevant to our future. Finance management, life management, racial history, far more relevant. And Captain Thunk says there's nothing wrong with it being available to be chosen by those that want to do it. Whilst dead, it is still pretty thoroughly embedded into our society and culture. It's not quite as irrelevant as some people first assume. It has more merit than some other subjects offered. We're finally connected to the wonderful Rania Khalek, who joins us now on this anniversary of that horrific explosion. Rania, thank you for that. Why, a year on, has nothing been done to repair the destruction or to find out who is responsible for this?
Well, you know, Lebanon is a country in collapse at the moment. So there is a lot of chaos taking place across the country. The port explosion helped accelerate that economic collapse. And so the port explosion is all tied up in who's going to be blamed for the economic collapse as well. And it's also been heavily politicized. You know, despite the fact that really the entire political class is responsible for this because it was a huge act of criminal negligence. There are people in power who are trying to use it against their political opponents to point the finger at them. There's also an attempt by some in adversarial countries to try to pin the blame on Hezbollah, so which, you know, was probably the least responsible party in this case, as well as with the economic collapse. So because of the politicized nature, because nobody wants to take credit for this awful event that took place, even though the entire political class is culpable, and because there's also this economic collapse taking place that's really strangling the country, I'm not sure if we're ever going to see a thorough investigation into what took place, and we're probably not really ever going to see anybody held accountable.
Tell us about that economic collapse. It seems to have accelerated since the explosion, but it seems now to be reaching a really crisis point.
Yeah, I mean, right now, you know, I'm speaking to you from Beirut, where this is the capital of the country, and the state isn't capable of providing more than about 2 to 3 hours of electricity a day. Right now, I'm lucky to be enough to have a building generator, which is why I have electricity to be able to talk to you at the moment. But much of the country doesn't have access to either a generator or the luxury of fuel for the generator, because the economic collapse has left the government completely broke and unable to import basic needs such as fuel and medicine. And it's leading to a real dramatic collapse of the country and creating kind of two classes of people. One is the majority of people who don't have access to dollars and therefore aren't able to keep up to the hyperinflation that's making basic products, especially food, you know, unaffordable. And then the other class of people, the smaller class who have dollars and, you know, are able to, you know, stretch those dollars and purchase whatever they want. On top of that, you know, Lebanon is also under what I would call, you know, kind of an unofficial siege. I mean, Lebanon's a small country. It's bordered by Syria on one side, which is suffering from these sanctions that the U.S. has imposed under the Caesar Act, which actually penalizes neighboring countries if they do business with Syria. So Lebanon can't trade with its neighbor Syria. Otherwise, it'll be subjected to U.S. sanctions, something it certainly can't afford at the moment, given that it already has its own economic collapse. Then to the south, you have Israel, which is, you know, an enemy state. So of course, there's no trade that can happen there. Israel, is an aggressive state, constantly bombing Lebanon, fighting with Lebanon. And then on the other side, Lebanon has the Mediterranean Sea. But as we saw last August, the port exploded. That was Lebanon's largest port. And so that really, really hurt the country. And on top of that, you know, you have this political class that created this Ponzi scheme economy. And it's important to note that Ponzi scheme economy was created by America's allies in Lebanon, not by Hezbollah. You know, the West and the international community are often trying to blame Hezbollah for this economic collapse, but really they're the least culpable party, if for no reason other than the fact that they've been under U.S. sanction and have been incapable of being a part of the Lebanese banking system because it's completely tied up with Western financial institutions. So as a result, Hezbollah's been largely left out of this economy that ultimately collapsed because the people who created it created a Ponzi scheme that was always destined to collapse. And now that it's collapsed, there are some countries that are perfectly happy to watch Lebanon sink because they think that that can be used as a way to weaken Hezbollah.
What's the political impact of this economic catastrophe? Is it, for example, ossifying the public in their traditional sectarian corrals, or is it breaking down those foolish sectarian divisions that have allowed these crooks to run Lebanon for as long as I've been going there, which is 40 years and more?
You know, I think it's a mix of those two things. I think a large, you know, whenever there's something that feels like an existential crisis, and I think this really, you could say this would be the case for any country or any society. People tend to cling to their community for shelter and safety, right? Even more. And so you do see a bit of clinging to those sectarian parties and the sectarian makeup of Lebanon even more because Lebanon has a very weak centralized state. And the state is intentionally made to be weak so that people have to rely on their communal leaders and their communal parties. And so as a result, because Lebanon doesn't have a centralized welfare system, in this situation, people are having to turn to those very sectarian parties in their towns and villages to make it through this very terrible situation. So in that sense, it's kind of it's making those sectarian lines more rigid. But in the other sense, I mean, there is a younger population in Lebanon that has grown up under this very corrupt and very, failing system that's been incapable of providing them basic services. And they tend to blame the entire political class. But, there isn't any sort of alternative organizing in Lebanon that has been effective or successful, that has managed to really present an alternative to the current system. And, I would argue that as awful as the sectarian system is, it's not the primary problem in Lebanon. It's a problem, and it certainly reinforces this corrupt system. But at the foundational level, the problem in Lebanon is neoliberalism, a neoliberal economic order that was imposed on Lebanon after the Civil War, and like I said, is reinforced through the sectarian system, as well as, what's happening around the country. It's not, you can't isolate what's happening in Lebanon to just Lebanon. Lebanon is impacted by what's happening in Syria. It's impacted by what's happening in Palestine. It's impacted by what's happening in Iran and Iraq. It's impacted by U.S. imperialism and Western aggression that has really destroyed and collapsed this region, and the ongoing economic warfare that continues to strangle countries like Iran and like Syria, and by extension, strangles Iraq and Lebanon as well.
Well, it seems ripe for revolution on the face of it. A system which is collapsed economically and politically, is entirely dysfunctional. The criminals are flying off if they can to escape the consequences. I would have thought, I can't think of a more revolutionary situation anywhere in my view. So why isn't there a revolution? Why don't the people who reject all of this rise up and take power in this weak state?
That's a very good question, and I think it goes to the issue of the resiliency of this weak and dysfunctional system. It's a resilient system. And, you have this kind of divide and conquer strategy. The sectarian makeup of it helps to reinforce it because it makes it possible, it makes it almost impossible to have a nationwide unified response to this corrupt ruling elite, because ultimately what ends up happening, and we saw this happen unfortunately in October 2019 when there were massive protests that crossed sectarian lines and crossed class lines, calling, for the end of this corrupt rule of this political elite. But ultimately, within just a few days, those became very politicized and weaponized by various political sectarian parties. And that's kind of an ongoing problem in Lebanon. We've seen the same thing happen with the response to the port blast. It almost seems like this sectarian system has made it Lebanon's destiny to be incapable of, putting forward a unified front against this system. And also, there's so much meddling in Lebanon, right? Lebanon isn't a sovereign country because it's constantly being meddled in by Saudi Arabia, by the US, by Qatar, by the UAE, by Turkey. So whenever anything does happen, all of these different interests try to get their hands in it and try to twist it in the direction they want it to go in. And that ultimately ends up ruining things. And I think that this is a common thing you see not just in Lebanon, but in other developing countries around the world who are subjected to this sort of outside meddling. It really denies people, locals, the ability to, create, to have power over their own country's policies. And that's what you see in Lebanon.
Rania Khalek, I wish I could talk to you longer, but I can't. Thank you for joining us, and stay safe in the lovely city of Beirut. Should Latin be taught in schools? I thought people wouldn't be interested, but they are. You can still vote right up until the end of the show. Let's hear from Jacob in St. Ives. Go ahead, Jacob.
Good evening.
Yes, good
Mr.
evening.
Galloway.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Nice to hear you. It was about your last caller, Jamie, who is the delivery guy for festivals.
Oh, yes.
Who seemed to be like anti-vaxxer sort of person.
Mm-hmm. Well, to be fair, he was explicitly against this vaccination. He didn't say what his attitude was to other vaccinations. So it wouldn't be right to misrepresent that. Yeah.
Very fair point. Very factual. Very factual. Now, if I was in his boots, I will probably go for the vaccine, even though I was infected with the coronavirus with a positive PCR test and symptoms in February, and I was not able to actually have this reflected onto my NHS COVID pass.
Mm-hmm.
And I got stuck in between rock and a hard place because I contacted the NHS Track and Trace, and they said, no, we don't deal with this. This is the COVID app which deals with that. And so I turned to the COVID app and said, well, I was infected. I want to have this on my record. And I was not able, after sending dozens of emails back and forward, to have this recorded. And because I'm only test daily driver, but I still think that people should think logically. If I had the disease and recovered from it, and I also had NHS asking for my plasma, which was a part of a controlled trial, when would they destruct my plasma and give it to people 40 years older than me, almost your age, George, to cure them. And then they called this trial off because I was participating in this trial, but they called it off, so they never took. I get to keep my blood and my plasma.
Mm-hmm.
So now, why wouldn't you test people for the amount of antibodies they have if they reluctant to take the vaccine, just to show what the threshold would have been?
Well, look, it's very interesting, Jacob. My position is a very simple one. Nobody should be forced by the state to be vaccinated. But
Thank you.
I am encouraging everyone to be vaccinated. Of course,
so do I.
It is experimental. How could it be otherwise? We couldn't wait 5 years with the coronavirus raging and cutting people down like hay in the fields in harvest time. We could not allow that to happen, so we've had to take the chance with a vaccine, which, seems to have worked. Of course, one may find people who have suffered bad reactions. We may find people who died. But we were dealing with an emergency situation in which our excess death rate per day, per week, per month, per year was frighteningly large, and now isn't. These are the facts. Let's talk to David in Ireland on Latin. Go ahead, David.
Hello, George.
Nice to hear from you. Go ahead.
Yeah, I totally agree with the fact that Latin should be taught in schools. Absolutely.
Tell me why.
Well, I mean, let's face it. We're in a time where most people can't even speak English, and I think Latin gets back. Someone earlier on alluded to the fact that Latin is involved in science and art and literature, and it's involved in every aspect of life.
Yeah.
And you can't just do away with. I mean,
nobody's doing away with it. There will always be prelates who can speak, although the Pope has turned his face against the Latin Mass, unfortunately. There will always be eggheads that can speak Latin, and maybe you're one of them. The question is, in a crowded syllabus, is that really the best thing that we can now introduce? Wouldn't Chinese be a more productive, profitable, important, new subject to introduce? Because I have to send my children to private Chinese school. I think it would be a good idea if Chinese was taught in the state schools, don't you?
Well, George, to be honest, there's a certain amount of languages that people can learn. Now, Melania Trump knows like 4, maybe 5 of them, but like you're talking about the average person here, so Latin is probably non grata.
Did you come on here, David, to deliver that joke?
No, it's not a joke, George.
Anyway, last word to you. Go ahead. We're running out of time.
Well, I would just like to say, George, happy birthday to your daughter.
Thank you.
And good luck to you, mate. And I've always stuck behind you, and I think everybody should know Latin.
God bless you. Thanks so much, David. I appreciate it. Now, don't forget you can download the podcast of this show from tomorrow, featuring a bite-sized version of all the interviews on tonight's show. Search Moats, the podcast, on whichever platform you normally get your podcasts from. And if you're not, like me, normally a purchaser, there's no money involved, it's free, a consumer of podcasts, consume this one. Clear the decks, the legend that is Norma is on the line, and life is just not the same if we don't hear from her. Go ahead, Norma. By the way, I owe you an apology. The Olympic Games turned out great. Britain was 4th in the medal table, a phenomenal achievement. And I saw some of it, quite a lot of it actually, this week, and it was wonderful. Hats off to Team GB, hats off to Tokyo, hats off to the Tokyo Olympics. Go ahead, Norma.
Oh, that's great, George. No, I've been sick with food poisoning this weekend.
What?
I don't know why, and I'm still feeling a bit queasy. But before your show, I actually listened, which relaxed me, really. It was on TV, and it was Host's Planet Suite.
Oh, yes. Wonderful piece of music.
Yeah, you know, with it, and the man gave a bit of an explanation about the planets, which was a bit different from our planet, and I suppose it was an escape. I mean, the composition of the music and the variety of all the planets was, you had Mars and Neptune, and then Jupiter was, I vow to me, like, my country. That's the one I like. Saturn, bringer of old age. And
we'll stay forever young, Norma. Thee and me will be forever young. And I hope you get over this bout of food poisoning. I don't know what it was that you ate that was dodgy, but avoid it from now on, because we cannot have the mother of all talk shows without you. It's been marvelous for me. I hope it was for you. If it was, come back next week at the same time, same place, and bring another listener with you.